Hi, everybody. I'm Bruce Korf. Until I retired about a year ago, I was seeing NF patients and doing research and clinical trials on NF at UAB. I had been providing care for persons with the various forms of neurofibromatosis for over 40 years, during which time I was privileged to witness many advances in NF diagnosis and treatment, including advanced imaging, genetic testing, clinical trials, and most recently, effective treatments for some manifestations of the condition. I'm unable to join you in person today because as I retired, we moved back up north to the Boston area where we'd lived before coming to Birmingham in 2003. Nevertheless, I've remained involved in NF and meet regularly with the clinical and research teams at UAB and remain involved in some national efforts as well. I'm delighted to see that the UAB NF program is thriving, with clinics for adults and children led by Doctors Brown and Metrock, respectively. The NF Clinical Trials Consortium remains active, with the coordinating center at UAB now led by Dr. Dahl, and the laboratory research team, including Drs. Wallace, Kesterson, Bedwell, Meyer, and others, remaining active. The program for today's symposium looks great, and I know you'll learn a lot from the various speakers lined up today. I think you'll see that exciting progress continues to be made in the quest to treat the various forms of neurofibromatosis. There is much, though, that remains to be done, and our team at UAB remains committed both to providing outstanding care and also helping to advance knowledge about the conditions and to develop new approaches to treatment. Thanks very much and enjoy the day.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank UAB for bringing us together. My name is Sasika Nanayakkara, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Eye Health and Wellness Foundation. I started Eye Health with a simple but powerful belief. Everyone deserves the opportunity to live a healthy, connected life, no matter how complex their condition may be. As we all know, NF is not just a medical diagnosis, it's a life-altering journey that touches every part of a person's life. Patients, children, and caregivers are fighting every day for better NF care, better support, and a better life. Now imagine trying to navigate that care alone. Endless appointments, confusing systems, no clear path forward. I'd like to share a story about a young woman I'll call Emma. For people with NF, it isn't just a story, it's their reality. Emma was diagnosed with NF1 as a child. Growing up, she faced not only medical challenges, frequent doctor visits, MRIs, and surgeries, but also the emotional weight of being different from her peers. She often told me the hardest part wasn't the tumors or the pain, but the isolation. Teachers didn't always understand her condition, friends drifted away, and even in the healthcare system, she often felt like just another case file. But Emma is resilient. She's now in college, advocating for herself, and even mentoring young NF patients. And Emma's story isn't unique. So many NF patients and families are searching not only for better treatments, but for connection, understanding, and hope. That's where Eye Health steps in, to close the gaps, to build bridges, and to remind patients they are not alone. At the end of the day, everything we do comes back to one truth. Patients like Emma must be at the center of care. To the patients and families here today, your voices matter. You are the experts of your own journeys. To the providers and researchers, we know your time and expertise are stretched thin, but your collaboration is essential. And to organizations and partners supporting the NF community, your involvement makes this possible. By joining efforts to support NF patients, you are investing in innovation, equity, and hope.
I'm here to record a video for you about my support for the Eye Health and Wellness Foundation. I'm really proud to be involved with this foundation because, like myself, its mission and its values align in that I truly believe that people should be empowered to understand their own health, to make informed decisions about it, to share their thoughts and feelings with the community. And this holds true not only for neurofibromatosis, or NF, but also Schwannomatosis, SWN, and other complex diseases. It's really about empowering people to make a difference in their own lives and in the lives of others who share in their experiences, and I stand 100% behind that.
At iHealth, we often say our mission is to help patients lead their care and not get lost in it. So my invitation to you today is simple. Let's work together. Let's make sure no NF patient feels invisible. And let's show the world that when community, innovation, and compassion come together, anything is possible. Thank you.
When one life changes, we all change. So how will you make a difference today?
Whether you're a patient, caregiver, or healthcare professional, you can make a difference. Partner with iHealth to transform care for those living with neurofibromatosis, NF, Schwannomatosis, SWN, and other complex conditions. Together, we can improve access, empower patients, and drive healthcare innovation. Your support helps us simplify care, connect communities, and create hope. Join us today and help transform lives.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Brown, and I'm the director of the NF and Schwannomatosis program at UAB and Children's of Alabama. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us in person, and also those of us who are listening virtually. And we will be recording these sessions, and so they should be available online. Look out for an email or a Facebook notification for that. We are incredibly excited to be having this symposium again in person. This symposium was previously held in person prior to COVID under the guidance of our director, Dr. Korf, who's retired in the past year. And I was fortunate enough to take over not only his practice, but then also all of the amazing people who I've met so far in Alabama. I moved down here from New York City, and it's been a positive experience on every front. You may be wondering about why the dog stuffies and the swan stuffies. A lot of people with NF and Schwannomatosis, in fact, a lot of physicians, have difficulty pronouncing and remembering neurofibromatosis and Schwannomatosis. They're not the easiest things to say. And so we thought we'd make it easier by providing you with a Newfoundland, both in person, thank you, Boo, and in the stuffy form, and a swan for Schwannomatosis. And hopefully this will help everybody remember what their diagnosis is, and we'll be using this in our logo moving forward. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first two speakers who are very special to our program. Unfortunately, Tammy Skelton, who I had the bio for, is unable to make it today. She's the nurse practitioner who's been serving children and adults in the NF clinic for many, many years. But we also have Micah Higgins, who is our nurse practitioner who works with Dr. Katie Metrock. And she, I am sure, has a long history that I don't have printed out in front of me. Maybe she could tell you a little bit more, but I can tell you about Renee Moss, who I was just saying was one of the first people I met when I moved down here. And Dr. Korf said she is the one to talk to if you want to know anything about the NF community in this area of the world. So Renee Moss has an MPH and lives in Vestavia Hills with her husband of 24 years, who is here as well, and her two children, Philip Jr. and Helen. Philip Jr. was diagnosed with NF1 in 2011 when a tumor was discovered in his neck. Following her son's diagnosis, Helen and Philip Sr. were both seen and diagnosed in 2013. Renee is an avid advocate for the neurofibromatosis community and the scientific and medical leaders dedicated to finding effective treatments for NF. She is a former chair of the Children's Tumor Foundation Volunteer Leadership Council and served as a patient liaison to the Synodos NF1 Research Consortium. She's also a patient representative on the Response Evaluation in NF and Schwannomatosis International Collaboration that's known as RAINS, helping researchers develop standardized response criteria for determining treatment responses in NF1. Please join me in welcoming these two amazing women who are going to tell you a little bit about what they love about our program.
Hey guys, good morning. Thank you for being here today. I know a lot of you guys travel from across the state, even some other states, to be here. So we're really honored that you've chosen to spend your day here at Children's of Alabama, learning alongside us. Like Dr. Brown said, my name is Micah Higgins. I'm a nurse practitioner in the neuro-oncology clinic here at Children's and work alongside the wonderful Dr. Katie Metrock in caring for our pediatric patients that receive their NF care here. This is my first symposium, so I'm excited to be here with you guys today. I joined the team about 2.5 years ago, so I'm in the post-COVID era of team members, but excited to experience this firsthand. I will definitely say that joining this team has been a very unexpected but highlighted part of my career. I didn't know much about NF coming into it. I've learned a lot from this group of people in this room. I could tell you some of the textbook answers, but it really was when I met the patients and their families and these caregivers that I learned that this is not just a diagnosis, it's really a lifelong journey, and it requires resilience and courage and a whole group of people to do it. And so that's why we're here today. As she said, most of you know Dr. Korf has entered into the realm of retirement, and so we are really happy for him, but also just want to convey to you guys that his legacy is deeply woven into what we're doing here today, and definitely a part of the vision to continue to provide really excellent care for this group of people. And he still joins us for a lot of our meetings and other things, so we are really dedicated to that vision here. The way we do that is through, really we use the word collaborative a lot, but that truly is what we're trying to do here, specifically with our pediatric and adult side. I know that Dr. Brown and Dr. Metrock have weekly meetings to discuss things for our NF clinic. We also have newly started this NF tumor board. So we meet once a month with this multidisciplinary group of people, specialists from all over our hospitals to discuss complex cases so that we really can get insight and vision from a lot of different angles as to how to provide best care for you guys and for your family members. I've learned so much being part of this team, but also I'm greatly encouraged that we're able to see this team grow outside of genetics and oncology, and really we're seeing ophthalmology, surgery, dermatology, genetics, the whole crew, neurology, wanting to be involved, and people that have taken an interest in making sure that we provide best care here. For those of you that don't know, probably many of you do, the Children's Tumor Foundation has recognized our facility as a comprehensive NF center, and you may know the numbers. I don't know how many throughout the United States are recognized for that, but it's few. And so we are really honored to hold that designation, but also say to you guys that that is not something that we just put as an award or a banner, but it really is what we carry as a responsibility to continue to grow this program through improving, through innovation, through research, but also through support of you guys. And so today is a huge part of that mission and in supporting the NF community. And I don't know if you've seen the lineup of speakers, but we've got some incredible people here. Some people that have walked in the same shoes as you have, but also some providers and have dedicated their careers to really making sure that we're able to grow this program and provide the most cutting edge treatments and outcomes for this patient population. So we really, whether you're new like me or you are well experienced and you've been here for quite some time on this journey, I really hope that you leave today with some new clarity, some great connections, and hopefully some hope for the future of our NF program. Just a couple quick thank yous for our caregivers in the room, the family members, the friends, spouses. Your love and your advocacy is really profound and makes a profound difference. And we couldn't be here without you guys. And for those individuals living with NF and Schwannomatosis, you guys are the real heroes of the group, and you are the why for what we do. So thank you guys for being here. We are truly honored to be a part of your team.
Thank you, Micah. Again, my name is Renee Moss, and I'm not going to repeat what Dr. Brown said or what Micah has said, but I will say that the first NF Symposium, UAB, and Children's Parent and Caregiver Symposium we attended was, I'm looking at my husband, 2012, right after our diagnosis. And we were, I don't know what, I see a lot of new faces, which makes me so happy. Because this is our first in-person, but it was a very dark and scary time for our family. And I don't know whether anybody in the room is feeling that, but if you know me, I am a complete extrovert, type A, OCD, want to fix it, my free therapy is connecting with people. And when we were first diagnosed, there was no treatment, there was nothing, and we were very, very scared and did not know anybody. So this was my community as a mother, and I'm so thankful for those of you in the room. And this is the first time I'm trying not to get emotional since COVID, but please come find me. I would love to meet you. I'd love to connect with you. And to our pharmaceutical partners in the room, that really makes me teary because you did not exist in 2011. And it's because of you and your partnerships with the patients and the clinics and the clinicians and the researchers and everybody that we have hope. So thank you for being here. And the fact that there are, I think, 3 of you is just amazing. And to Dr. Dahl, thank you for being here too. I know there's a lot of different things of hemonc and oncology that you could be here, and so you giving up your Saturday, as well as Dr. Metrock and Dr. Brown and the other physicians and students in the room, it really means a lot to us that you would provide your time and your resources and your heart to us. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I would say. I joked that I went up to a lady at Costco. Does anybody know Costco? Anybody loves Costco? Okay. So Sunday afternoon is the worst time to go to Costco, right after church. If you're a churchgoer, that's when we go because we're crazy. And it's because the pizza's $1.50, right? It's a cheap meal. So I'm in line with 1 million people, and it looks like Hunger Games for a $1.50 piece of pizza. And I see a woman who's visibly affected by NF. And I'm like, I'm going to go do it. I'm going to go say hi. So I walk up, I was like, excuse me, my family has NF. And she's like, uh-huh. And I said, I just want to introduce myself, Anyway, and she's like, okay, thanks. And I felt so bad. I was like, she clearly was not in the headspace to meet me or uncomfortable with this. Well, we had been visiting a new church, and we visit a new Sunday school class last Sunday, and I walk in, and she's sitting there. And so I was like, okay, don't do it, Rainey. She's going to be a stalker. She's going to put her restraining order. I didn't say anything to her that day, but I did, of course, being 50, I'm still on Facebook. So I Facebook friended her, and she thankfully, said this. And I messaged her. I said, oh my gosh, I hope it's okay. You probably don't remember me. And what I do when somebody connects, I'll always end whatever my introduction with is, I will not contact you again if I don't hear from you. I respect your confidentiality and your boundary. But if you want to, I'm here for you. And usually somebody will reply, but I completely respect that boundary otherwise. Well, she was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you connected. I've heard about you for so long. I'm like, thank you. And we had this long conversation about her daughter who's 14, and she is legally blind from optic gliomas. And now we're all connected. So being the Southern girl I am, I'm going to find people, and I'm going to try to connect because it's meant a lot to me. And so if you have not done that, please have the courage and trust to do that. And if you don't, I'll be your girl. I'll take care of it for you. So thank you for being here.
Rini, before you walk away, and thank you both for such an amazing introduction. For those patients and families and caregivers who are not here today, you said that you would welcome being reached out to. How would they reach out to you?
Well, I mentioned I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. It's a really cryptic name. Are you ready? Rini Moss. Very easy. There's very few Rini Mosses in the world. There are multiple different support groups online, and social media tends to be the best way to connect. But you come find me, and I'll give you my email, my cell phone number, whatever you need today if you'd like to. And you have absolute free reign to give it to anybody else. I always tell the physicians, HIPAA be damned, give my information out, whatever you want. If somebody needs to connect, please know that you have a green light to do that. So.
At this point, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker this year, who was a patient who I met earlier this year, and she just really moved me when I met her in clinic. She had been through an awful lot, and some of the aspects of her condition were not the most common ones, and she faced a lot of challenges both with her condition and in her life in general, and she was a really good conversationalist. And I said, excuse me, would you like to speak at our symposium? And she said, yes. So I'm honored to present her now. Charlene Bishop. Her talk is entitled Living with Neurofibromatosis Type 1. Charlene is a longtime patient at the UAB NF program, first under the care of Dr. Bruce Korf, and now with Dr. Rebecca Brown, that's me, following Dr. Korf's retirement. Diagnosed with neurofibromatosis type 1 in her preteen years, Charlene has lived with the condition for decades and brings a deeply personal perspective to the NF community. As a military wife for 20 years, she experienced frequent relocations and care from many different doctors. These experiences taught her the importance of self-advocacy and resilience in navigating NF. Now 59, Charlene shares her journey to encourage others living with NF and their families, offering hope and insight into thriving despite challenges. Please join me in welcoming Charlene.
That's a lot to say, and I appreciate what she said. And I am a little nervous. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this in this large of group. Now, I have shared my story personally when I get to know someone, or if someone does come up and ask me questions, then I share about neurofibromatosis. I think it's important. Thank you. I think it is important for us to share our stories. And I know we each have a story, to strangers, to your family, to your friends, to your coworkers. It's important for someone to know, and I'd rather someone ask me, does it hurt my feelings sometimes? Yes, it does. Um, I've always worked with children, and I'll share a little bit with my story with that. Children, they're going to tell you like it is. They're going to speak from their heart. But I had one child to say, she asked me and I told her. And how I explain it, especially to children on their level, is that I was born this way. God made me this way. He made me special just like he made you special. You have brown hair, you have brown eyes, you have blue eyes. That's all they need to hear. Then they know that I'm just like them. And that's what one little girl said. But Miss Charlene, you're just like us. And we are. We're no different. We have health issues and things that we have to deal with. But let me introduce myself, and you guys just bear with me because, like I said, I am a little nervous. First time I've done anything like this before. But my name is Charlene Bishop. And this might be the first time for some of you to be in the same room with someone else who has neurofibromatosis. It is for me. I am 59 years old, and I was diagnosed with neurofibromatosis in my preteens. It started with a small rise on my left eye. I went to a few doctors before walking into a dermatologist's office, and he said this long word that was very difficult to pronounce, neurofibromatosis. I'm so glad we can say NF for short. It makes it a lot easier to say, especially when you're sharing it with someone else. Even though neurofibromatosis can be genetic, I'm a spontaneous mutation, meaning I am the only one in my family who has it. I grew up in a supportive and loving family. I grew up with friends that most didn't even know that I had it until I shared it with them. I lived a normal life, if there is such a thing. I was homecoming queen at my high school. I stayed active in both school and church. I married in 1989 to a man who was in the military. We moved every 3 to 4 years for 20 years, and because of this, I would have to start over with friends, churches, and doctors at each station we were transferred to. And that could be very difficult. Our first station was Scituate, Massachusetts. I felt like I was at the end of the earth. I cried all the way there from Alabama to Massachusetts, first time I'd ever been away that far from home. But because of that move, I was fortunate to have met Dr. Robert Martuzza, a prominent neurosurgeon and brain researcher specializing in neurofibromatosis. He was on staff at Mass General in Boston, Massachusetts. He founded one of the first NF clinics in the United States in 1982. I learned more in that one visit about NF than I had since being diagnosed. My husband and I were introduced to a genetic specialist in the NF clinic, where we discussed of having children. We were told that it would be 50-50 chance of passing neurofibromatosis to our children if we chose to have children on our own. My husband and I discussed what our choice would be, and I had also worked with children through teaching preschool, Head Start, and several child care centers, and knew how easy it was to love someone else's child. So we chose adoption. Our next station was New Orleans, Louisiana. This is where I had my first surgery to remove a neurofibroma tumor from my back. The tumor was near the spine and was continuing to grow after initially being found. It had become painful when being hugged, and I was not ready to give my hugs up. My NF doctor referred me to an oncologist surgeon. It was safely removed, clipping it away from a non-major nerve. Again, I had found the right doctors who were knowledgeable in neurofibromatosis. But I have also met a lot of doctors that did not know about it, only remembering maybe a short study in one of their medical studies while in medical school. Our next move led us to a place called Eufaula, Alabama. I wondered why God would lead us to such a small town. I would find out why later on as we began to make our home there for almost 5 years, which was rare to stay in one place. When I would make new friends and coworkers, I would share about my disorder and also mine and my husband's choice to adopt. Here's where my journey starts at UAB Kirkland Clinic. It was about a 3-hour drive from Eufaula. I would travel to Jasper, Alabama, and that's where I was born and raised. I would stay with family and visit and attend my doctor's appointments. While we lived in Eufaula, I had a friend approach me about a family finding out that their little girl had neurofibromatosis. They were devastated to learn about this and just thought that, her life was over. I reached out to the family, introducing myself and sharing that I also had NF. We became very close friends. This allowed them to see that one can live with neurofibromatosis, that their life does not have to be over. This once little girl, beginning in kindergarten when I first met her, she is now a teacher, married with 3 children of her own. While we're in Eufaula, we also began the process of our adoption. I met a family who had adopted through Lifeline in Birmingham, Alabama. They introduced me to Lifeline with information and resources. But it was not until a year later when I was also introduced to Lifeline through my mother. Save a Life, a pregnancy and resource center, had visited her church one night discussing their relationship with Lifeline, the adoption agency. I felt this was a God thing and not by chance for me to hear about it again. Within a week, we had paperwork and then our home study. And that was a year later, and then the wait began. The waiting is always the hardest part. But what we didn't know is that it was preparation. God was preparing us to be parents for the child that He had chosen for us. We were transferred to Mobile, Alabama for only a short time. They wanted to move us to Key West, Florida, but we asked to stay in Alabama if all possible because our adoption had not happened yet. The military did work with us and transferring us to Demopolis, Alabama. Within 2 weeks of that conversation in 1998, God blessed us with a beautiful baby girl, Hannah Grace. God's hand has been in my story. A night of struggling, wanting to be a mother, God led me to His word. I have prayed for this child. The Lord granted me what I asked for. 1 Samuel 1:27. It's an honor that God chose me to be her mother. She is the greatest gift. He did answer my prayers, and she will soon be 27 years old, and she is with me today. I continued to follow my neurologist at Kirkland until we were transferred to Virginia in 2002. Here we go again, new friends, church, coworkers. My tumor, where it all started on my left eye, began to grow, making my eye look very swollen. I also started to get more tumors throughout my body, inside and out. I really didn't have an NF specialist in Virginia. So 3 years later, we were transferred back to New Orleans, Louisiana. My daughter and I moved back to Jasper, Alabama, my hometown, where her dad had finished his last tour in the service. And this was not long after Hurricane Katrina, so there was not many places for family housing, and that's why she and I chose to go back home while he finished. I was able to go back to UAB Kirkland Clinic, where I became a patient of Dr. Bruce Korf's in the genetic clinic. I was evaluated for surgery for the tumor located on my left eye that had grown to the point my eye was beginning to close. The plastic surgeon took his time reaching out to other colleagues before taking my case. He did an excellent job. It helped with lifting my eye where I could see better and removed as much of the tumor as that he could without causing nerve damage. It was very difficult because it was very scary. That was the first big surgery that I'd had because of my NF. It took 3 surgeries to complete it. This was 2006 when all of that took place. Then in 2007, I went through a divorce. Through this storm in my life, I was blessed with the support of my friends, family, and my faith. In 2015, for months, I had begun to have high blood pressure and heart palpitations. I'd also suffered from migraines since I was a teenager. My symptoms were shrugged off for months until God gave me a kidney stone. It wasn't fun, but he had his reasons. The urgent care doctor ordered a CT scan that did show a kidney stone that would pass on its own, but also that same scan showed a mass as big as a baseball on my right adrenal gland. And these were from the symptoms that I was having that got shrugged off. So and that was, it's called a pheochromatoma. Again, I'm so glad that we can have things so we can short it. It makes it easier. So I had a pheo. Patients who have neurofibromatosis are at a higher risk for having them. I was one of the lucky ones. I had to be placed on blood pressure medication that had, in order for them to be able, for about 2 weeks, for them to be able to safely remove it. In January of 2016, it was removed along with my right adrenal gland. The surgeon then says the pheo could put me at a higher risk for thyroid cancer. And since I had a multinodule goiter, let's go ahead and remove it. That led to having my thyroid and my parathyroids removed in April of 2016, placing a partial parathyroid back in. When the pathology report came back, I was told it was cancer. The surgeon had made the right choice to remove my thyroid, to be cautious. When I healed from the surgeries, my neurologist here at Kirkland recommended that I go to MD Anderson in Houston, Texas. I've been able to meet with a wonderful team of doctors. One of my team of doctors is Dr. John Slopus, who specializes in NF in the Brain and Spine Clinic. He is a medical director of the Neurofibromatosis program at MD Anderson. All of my initial first-time scans with MD Anderson were complete. The radiologist discovered a gastrostromal intestinal tumors in my lower intestines. That sent me to the sarcoma clinic. I have continued appointments each year to follow the pheos and the GIST. Patients who have neurofibromatosis can have a higher risk of having GIST and also cancer, even if it doesn't run in your family. It's important to be your own advocate. When it comes to your health, we are told not to Google, but I think we need to stay on top of the information regarding our health and treatments that could benefit us, our children, and our family, especially the future for those who hear for the first time that big, long word, neurofibromatosis. Don't be afraid to speak up to your doctors with questions. You can be an educator telling others about NF if it's your friends, your family, strangers, and yes, even doctors. Neurofibromatosis is a part of me, but it's not who I am. It can be a part of you, but it's not who you are. It's what's inside the heart that matters the most. That's who we are. I want to thank Dr. Rebecca Brown in neuro-oncology, who replaced Dr. Kaur, who was in the genetics clinic, who is now retired. I feel she and her team is a great asset to UAB and to our NF family. I am thankful. I feel she and her team are bringing hope to the NF family. Thank you.
Our next speaker is very special. He is the head of the NF Clinical Trials Consortium, not just at UAB, but across the United States. The Clinical Trials Consortium was put together by Dr. Korf initially, and the goal was to make it easier for NF centers of excellence to open up clinical trials for both NF and Schwannomatosis. So Dr. Dahl is a professor of pediatrics. He currently resides in Birmingham, where he serves as the Benjamin Russell Endowed Chair in Pediatric Hematology and Oncology and Division Director of the Pediatric Hematology Oncology and Blood Marrow Transplantation Program at UAB and Children's of Alabama. He is Deputy Director of the Neurofibromatosis Clinical Trials Consortium, and he is titled Senior Scientist at UAB's O'Neill Comprehensive Cancer Center. He is also head of the Pediatric Neuro-Oncology Program. Dr. Dahl currently co-chairs the Head Start for an international multi-institutional clinical trial and is also the chair of the COG's Young Investigators Committee and member of COG CNS Steering Committee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dahl.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And it's an honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. And thank you to Dr. Brown and Dr. Metrock and Micah and the organizing team to put this symposium together. This is the first time I am participating here, but I have participated in a symposium like this when I was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where we used to do this for our patients and families as well. So as Dr. Brown said, I took over from Dr. Bruce Korf as the director of the NF Consortium here, Operations Center, and also the principal investigator. I don't pretend to fill his shoes. I feel that if all of us combined with Dr. Metrock, Dr. Brown, myself, our efforts will hopefully we'll be able to partially fill Dr. Korf's shoes. He was really amazing. So I don't have any disclosures. So I'll talk a little bit about the NF Clinical Trials Consortium and what treatment options we have available here at UAB, but also nationally. So the NF Clinical Trials Consortium, it was funded by the Department of Defense. The first grant we applied in 2006. And this was to develop and perform clinical trials for treatment of NF complications in children and adults. So this grant was funded every 5 years since then, and most recently in 2022, where it was funded for 10 years until 2032. The goals of the NF Clinical Trials Consortium is to develop innovative biologically based therapies for children and adults with NF and schwannomatosis, and also to implement hypothesis-driven translational trials, which is from bench to the bedside, for multiple clinical manifestations of this disease, and to rapidly improve outcomes of children and adults with NF and schwannomatosis. So we have currently 24 sites, but we started with 9 sites in 2007 when the consortium was formed. More sites were added, and we went up to 20 sites in 2012 and 24 sites in 2017, and we continue with 24 sites today. And this is just a map of all the sites of the NF Clinical Trials Consortium, which is based at UAB. So we have sites in the Northeast, we have sites in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then on the West in LA and Utah. We also have 2 sites in Australia, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney. So this is the NF Consortium leadership. So as I said, I'm the PI. I took over from Dr. Korf of the consortium nationally, and also the director of the Operations Center. Dr. Metrock is the deputy director of the Operations Center of the consortium here at UAB. Dr. Michael Fisher, he's the scientific chair of the consortium, and he's based at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. DeBlanc is the vice chair, scientific vice chair, and he's at Cincinnati Children's. And Dr. Richard Applins is the director of the data center, which is at CHOP. It used to be at UAB, but we moved it a couple of years ago to CHOP. And this is our really fantastic, the NFCTC operations team. The administrative team is led by Karen Cole-Ploud, and she's assisted by Tiffany McNair and Morgan Curlett. The regulatory team is led by Juliet Southworth and assisted by Michelle Bird. And the clinical team is led by L.A. Baldwin, Lauren Ashley Baldwin, and assisted by Stephanie and Lynn Merritt. And this is the data team at CHOP, as I said, led by Dr. Richard Applins. And he's assisted by Dr. Lee, who's Associate Professor of Biostatistics, and then Lindsay Hall and Lara Lechtenberg, who are red cap of the database administrators, and Coretta Thomas, who is at UAB but works for the data center. She's the data manager. So what has been the impact of this consortium over the life of the consortium? So we have launched about 23 clinical trials. 9 clinical trials are in development. We've enrolled more than 500 patients on clinical trials in NF and schwannomatosis. We've published 21 papers in peer-reviewed journals. 5 papers are in preparation or have been submitted. There have been 43 abstracts submitted to international meetings and 48 invited talks. And over the life of the consortium, we have leveraged about over $12 million in funds from drug companies, other consortia, and other grants and such. And more recently, as you all know, mirdametinib was approved. They received FDA approval for treatment of plexiform neurofibromas, and this was based on the results from the NF106, which is a clinical trial conducted through the NF Consortium. So these are just, we put together this slide. So these are the different challenges that the patients face, NF and schwannomatosis patients face. So one is neurofibromas, then malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors or MPNSTs, gliomas in the brain, neurocognitive side effects, bone changes, and then schwannomatosis. So these are the trials that are listed that have already been completed in each of these disease manifestations in children and adults. And then these are the trials, the ones in green. I'll be talking about these trials individually, but these have been green-lit to be opened over the next, very soon or over the next year or so. The trials in purple that I read, we just recently received word and funding for these, so hopefully these trials will also move forward. But the trials in red are the ones that are at risk of opening. So as some of you may or may not know, so our grant that we received in 2022 for 10 years to do these clinical trials, that was taken out by the current administration, and they completely cut our funded off from it. Went from all the way 25 million to zero in the fiscal year 2025. So we were there at the Hill this year advocating with all the families NF from all over the country, and we plan to go again in February. So this year, for the next fiscal year, right now, they have put it back in the NF research program into the budget, but in the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate has forwarded as well, but we'll see if the administration finally approves it or they next it again. So we'll find out. So, but before that, actually, I don't want to leave it as such a depressing statement. So because we did receive some funding upfront, we were front loaded a little bit so we could start some trials. We have enough funding to continue to operate despite having $0 this year until at least 2029. So we have enough. So these green trials, the ones in green, with the current dollars that we have in our consortium, I think we should be able to finish these trials in green. And also maybe the trials in purple is mostly the trials in red that we will not be able to complete if we don't get another dollar from Congress. Okay, so for schwannomatosis, we have completed one trial, which is NF110. It was a phase 2 study of crizotinib for vestibular schwannomas. And this was based on preclinical data or mouse data, which showed that crizotinib shrinks tumors in mice compared to controls. The objective of this trial was to look at volumetric responses or shrinkage of these vestibular schwannomas. Eligibility was patients more than 6 years of age with progressive tumors. This drug was given orally. This was led by Dr. Matthias Karionis at Sloan Kettering. This was a 2-stage design, and then this trial was closed after the first stage because we did not observe any objective responses in the 10 patients we enrolled. However, the 29 non-target, which is non-vestibular schwannomas and meningiomas, we're still looking to see if there was any effect of this drug. For plexiform neurofibromas, we have these 3 trials, NF119, 114, and 113. So first one is with the Helix compound, HLX-1502. NF114 is a secondary prevention trial, and 113 is a combination of cabozantinib and selumetinib, and I'll go over these in detail. So NF119 is a phase 2 study with a compound called HLX-1502. This study is being shared by Dr. Miriam Bornhorst. This is a phase 2 study. That means the purpose of this study is to look at efficacy if this drug works for plexiform neurofibromas. And this drug was identified through AI drug discovery platform and then showed that in genetically engineered mouse models, you can see the graph on the graph on the right, when this drug was given, these tumors shrank very similar to how they would shrink with a MEK inhibitor or selumetinib. So showing that this drug works. The eligibility for this trial is 16 years and above for progressive or morbid plexiform neurofibromas. So we just have an amendment that was approved, and we're hoping that this amendment will go through in the next month or so at all the institutions. We're dropping the age to 12 years of age from 16. So we'll be including 12 to 15-year-old patients as well. The objective is to see radiographic responses in the plexiform neurofibromas and obviously to look at the toxicity of this drug. This is given orally. So this trial is open at UAB and also at multiple other NF consortium sites in the country. This trial is really interesting. This is NF114. This is this is not treatment. This is a secondary prevention trial. I'm going to include all of these. So this is a secondary prevention trial. So this has three parts. So the part one is we're going to look at patients who have NF1 but no known plexiform neurofibromas. And if they consent, then we will do whole brain MRIs on those patients. Whole body MRIs, sorry, not whole brain. Whole body MRIs to look for plexiform neurofibromas periodically. So either if the patients do not develop any plexiform neurofibromas, that's great. But if we identify on whole body MRIs any measurable plexiform neurofibroma in a critical location, then those patients will be given an opportunity to enroll in part two. And in part two, the idea is half the patients will be just observed, like we would do clinically. Half the patients will receive selumetinib, which is a MEK inhibitor. And the idea here is to look to see whether these can be prophylactic. Can we prevent the growth of these plexiform neurofibromas in the critical organs so that they don't threaten the critical organs in the future? Typically, the way it happens is we wait until these plexiform neurofibromas threaten the critical organ, then we start treatment. Here, we're going to be preventive and see, can we prevent the growth so we never get to the point that they threaten the critical organ? And then the part three, after they've been treated for a year, they're going to be offered part three, where we can see if we lower the dose, can a response be maintained? So currently, this study is open for NF1, 1 to 8 years of age with no known plexiform neurofibromas. We hope to accrue at least 150 to 200 patients because we don't know how many patients will develop plexiform. So this is an important study. This is open at about 6 or 7 institutions, not 24 sites currently, but it's open at UAB, and we're in the process of opening at all the sites in the consortium. Then this next study, which is almost about to be open, it's NF113, which is a combination of cabozantinib and selumetinib for plexiform neurofibromas. This study is led by Dr. Koch at CHOP. This is a phase 1, phase 2 trial. The rationale is we know we've done clinical trials with both of them. We know that we see good responses when you give a single agent cabozantinib or selumetinib. What if we combine these two agents? Will we increase the number of response rates for the patients, or will it just increase toxicity? So the idea is to combine them with an effort that we can get more robust responses. That's the idea. This is based on the data on the right. As you can see, the tumor volumes are lowest when both of these compounds are given together, both of these drugs, and compared to when they're given individually. So we are still in contract phase. As soon as the contracts are done, the study will be open. We're hoping by the end of this year or latest by January or February, this will be open at least at UAB, and then it'll be rolled out to all the other sites to be open. So phase 1 aims is to first to look at the maximum tolerated dose of both of these drugs when they're giving together. Phase 1B is just to expand to more number of patients once we find the recommended phase 2 dose. And then the phase 2, the aim is efficacy, is to deeper tumor responses. Can we get sustained tumor response when both of these drugs are given together? Again, to be eligible, you have to be more than 16 years of age with progressive or morbid plexiform neurofibroma. And if the patients have had MEK inhibitor or cabozantinib, they cannot be included on this trial. Coming to malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors, or MPNSTs, we have 3 clinical trials. The first one is nivolumab and ipilimumab. These are sorry for these names, but these are checkpoint inhibitors. These are immune modulating therapies. The whole idea is that these drugs, when we give them, this allows our own immune cells in the body to recognize these tumor cells as foreign and attack them, just like they would attack bacteria and viruses. So that's the idea of giving these 2 drugs. This was a single institution study led by Dr. Blakely at Johns Hopkins. The objective was to look at feasibility of giving these two medications before surgery, before any other definitive treatment, and the patients who were more than 12 years of age were included. The results, the feasibility endpoint was reached for 11 out of 12 enrolled patients, and they did not see any unexpected or serious adverse events for this study. NF112 is coming down the pipeline after, as I mentioned, 114 is open, 113 with cabo and selumetinib is next one. And then NF112 is a phase 1/2 trial of, again, a MEK inhibitor, a bromodomain inhibitor, ZEN3694 by Zenith, and then durvalumab, which is also an immune modulating therapy for refractory MPNSTs and other sarcomas. So this is a collaboration between SARC, which is the Sarcoma Alliance of Institutions, and the NF Clinical Trials Consortium. As you can see on the right here in the curve, if you give these combined drugs together, so this is the fold of tumor growth. So if it's in the negative, that means the tumors are shrinking. If you see bars going up, that means the tumors are growing. And you can see that once you give the combo, both of these drugs together, you can see the tumors shrink and they grow when they're giving alone. So this is the clinical trial that we're still. So the eligibility is going to be more than 18-year patients, more than 18 years of age for refractory recurrent sarcomas. This is all sarcomas for the phase 1 component, where we're trying to see what dose is tolerable in patients. So this is not just for NF patients, but part 2 is going to be NF1 with refractory recurrent MPNST. So once we have the dose of all these 3 drugs, that's when we will open it to NF patients who have recurrent or refractory MPNSTs. This study is expected to open. We're still going through contracting with Zenith, and so we're hoping that by mid next year, early first or second quarter of 2026, we should be able to have the study open. Third one is currently a single institution that's being planned. It's a MEK inhibitor and MDM2 inhibitor for atypical neurofibromas and MPNSTs, led by Dr. Kim in DC. And this is through a parallel clinical trials award through the NFRP, which is the Neurofibromatosis Research Program through DoD. So again, the phase 1 is for relapse and unresectable MPNSTs more than 18 years of age. Phase 2 is also for relapse unresectable MPNSTs, but phase 0 is when you give the drug and then try to measure the concentration in the tumor to see if it's getting into the tumor at all. So this study is currently under review, and we hope that we can get this open depending upon the funding. Just going to list all of these here. So these are the studies that have been approved, and before we heard about our funding situation. So NF115, so if the funding situation improves, we hope that we can get a lot of these trials open. It is studying the phase 2 study of guanfacine, which is an ADHD medication for ADHD in children with NF1. The NF116 is the bone natural history study. We want to see the natural history of bone development in children with NF1. NF117, very similar to 114, which was a prevention of plexiform. This is a prevent hearing loss in NF2 patients with vestibular schwannomas using losartan. There's another study for vestibular schwannomas or NF2 patients, which is a phase 2 trial of a YAP1 TEAD inhibitor. We're still in discussions with the company, and we're trying to develop this protocol. The next 2 studies, they're also phase 2 trial of MEK inhibitor and FAK inhibitor for MPNSTs, and then the most importantly, NF Extend, which is the long-term outcome study for the consortium. So all the patients who are enrolled on studies, we hope to enroll them on this long-term study and catch how the patients are doing with patient-reported outcomes, with neurocognitive data, with the toxicities from treatment. We'll just have one umbrella protocol. So the only two studies which we hope we can continue despite the funding freeze is the NF118. We just received funding from Gilbert Family Foundation, who've been really amazing. Once they knew that the funding had been taken away by Congress, they came forward and gave us money for this trial. This is for patients with high-grade gliomas or malignant gliomas in patients with NF. Which fortunately is rare, but it does happen. And that includes a MEK inhibitor and radiotherapy in these patients. So we have funding for this trial, and we're trying to develop this protocol. And then NF120, it's a phase 1/2 trial of MEK inhibitor and TYK2 inhibitor for MPNSTs. This is led by Dr. Vanessa Yulo at UAB. She has received funding for this trial through another mechanism. So we hope that we can move this trial forward in the next, in 2026 at some point as well. I think that's all I have, and there are lots of acknowledgements. There's a lot of site PIs at all our 24 sites, and our scientific chair, Dr. Fisher, operations center team, data center team, and all our pharmaceutical sponsors for these drugs. Thank you very much.
Dr. Dahl, amazing work, and I'm sure everybody, as I am, is impressed with the number of trials that UAB and the Clinical Trials Consortium is overseeing, particularly with the trial NF114, but for all of these trials. If somebody who is listening or rewatching this event online has a child or is themselves interested in a clinical trial, what is the best move for them to find out more information and to be considered?
That's a question. Sorry. Yes. I honestly, I should have put my email up there, but if you look at UAB and NF Clinical Trials Consortium, you should have all the information to get in touch with us. I put in information for all the operations center folks. But if you reach out, so hold on. So L.A. Baldwin, she's our clinical research manager, and she's the clinical lead. She gets queries from all over the country from patients and their families about these clinical trials. So please feel free to reach out to L.A. if you have any questions.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
So now I'd like to introduce myself. I tell people I'm a PhD MD. I was certain I wanted to be a researcher in the lab. And then after spending many key years of my life in the darkness, watching rats procreate, I had a change of career. And no, really, my research I felt was very important, but personally, I wanted to work more with people, and I wanted my research to benefit people more directly. But initially, I went into neurology and neuro-oncology, intending at some point to run my own wet lab. And COVID, like for many of us, derailed those plans for me. I was at that time a single mother and could not spend time in the lab. And I thought, well, maybe I should apply some of these skills I have to clinical research and translational research. And that's what brought me around to running industry-sponsored trials and also to writing up my own clinical trials based on what I see in my patients and where I see needs based on my background in molecular biology. So given that, I'm going to move on. These are my affiliations, disclosures. So let's talk about the types of neurofibromatosis. There is, as many of us know, NF1 or NF, and Schwannomatosis or SWN. And the reason that we have chosen these mascots today is that NF and Schwannomatosis are difficult to pronounce. So if you forget which one you have, which is quite common, just remember a Newfoundland or a swan. NF or NF1 is characterized by the skin bumps that we frequently see, as well as freckling in the armpit. Patients can have tumors within the brain, particularly in the vision nerves or pathways, and neurofibromas elsewhere that we call plexies or plexiform neurofibromas. Schwannomatosis now includes NF2. I'll talk about this in a later slide, but schwannomatosis is characterized by potentially tumors in the hearing nerves, not always. Those are called vestibular schwannomas. Schwannoma nerve tumors in the arms or the legs or next to the spine, meningiomas, which are tumors in the tissue that wraps around the brain, although not in the brain itself, and ependymomas, which occur usually at the top of the spinal cord. I hear sometimes in my clinic that a patient will come in and say, I think I have NF3. And I'll say, well, what does that mean to you? And they'll say, oh, I have a very severe form of this condition. And so I think mine it qualifies as the number 3. So there, and I'm not making light, but there is no NF3. We did talk for a while as a scientific community about how to talk about schwannomatosis and NF2 before we folded them together. And schwannomatosis was for a time being referred to informally as NF3, but it is not an official diagnosis. So these are the 2 gentlemen you have to blame for the fact that we can't pronounce anything. They're both German pathologists, and oh my goodness, we have so much in the scientific world that we owe to German pathologists, but this is not their shining moment. So Theodor Schwann on the left lived in Westphalia, Germany, and he really dedicated his life to understanding biology in general. He was the first scientist who realized that not just plants, but animals also are made of things called cells. And he was particularly interested in the nervous system. And he was the one that figured out that these wrappings around the axons of neurons were actually cells themselves. And later on, after he died, those cells were named after him and were called Schwann cells, and everything else flowed from there. The researcher on the right is Friedrich von Recklinghausen, who he lived in Cologne, Germany, and he didn't actually do the initial research himself, but he dug back through the records and he looked at these tumors that were taken off of the skin of certain individuals, and he described them as those tumors as being a mix of fibrous tissue and neurons or neuron-like cells, and that's where we get neurofibromatosis, which has also been referred to throughout history at times as von Recklinghausen's disease, and this is why, because of him. Also of note, the gentleman who had who was called the Elephant Man, he did not have NF1. We now know he had a different condition. So what did happen to NF2? NF2 is now schwannomatosis. We actually have multiple categories now of schwannomatosis, and some of those categories are purely academic and some of them are not. So we have NF2 related schwannomatosis. You can still call it NF2. We still call it NF2, but the official term is NF2 related schwannomatosis because now we know that it belongs in this family of conditions that are all characterized by similar and overlapping tumors. There's also SMARCB1 related schwannomatosis, and this is just a condition that's caused by a mutation in a different gene, but that sits right next to the NF2 gene. And we have LZTR1 related schwannomatosis, and then there's a whole series of categories if no gene is identified. So for NF2 related schwannomatosis, we know that the cause is that there's a mutation that prevents NF2 from doing its job. For SMARCB1 and LZTR1 related schwannomatosis, we know that there's a mutation in SMARCB1 or LZTR1 that then leads to the loss of NF2, that then leads to the tumors. And we think this may be why with NF2, we see the greatest number and diversity of tumors, whereas with SMARCB1 and LZTR1, really more steps have to happen before you get a tumor. And so potentially that might be why fewer of the tumors that I'm going to talk about are associated with those 2 conditions. And then for an awful lot of people, no gene is identified. So what does this mean? This means that we send your blood for DNA testing, we don't find anything. Maybe we send it for RNA testing, we don't find anything. What we then have to do is get 2 different tumors from different parts of the body and send those for genetic testing. And let's say both of those have lost their NF2 gene, but in a different way. Then we know that there's some bad player there that's causing that NF2 gene to be lost, but we don't know what it is. So that would be that last category where no gene is identified. And that actually makes up the largest percentage of people who have non-NF2 schwannomatosis. So what's the difference between NF1 and schwannomatosis? Well, there's a lot, and I'm going to go through it. The genes are on completely different chromosomes. These guys are not even anywhere near each other. NF1 is on chromosome 17, And Schwannomatosis, NF2, LZTR1, and SMARCB1 are all on chromosome 22. In addition, schwannomas grow differently than neurofibromas do. Schwannomas grow what we say sort of I tell people on the outside of the nerve. So they're still within this tissue that wraps around all of the nerve fibers, but it's really behaving itself and growing around only a small number, 1 or 2 of those nerve fibers. And so if you need to remove a schwannoma, you can pretty much lop it off. And of course, I'm not to belittle the work that the neurosurgeons are doing. They're monitoring the nerve function and being very careful, but it is possible for the nerve to remain completely intact after you remove a schwannoma. And in the bottom there, I have a picture of the histopathology of schwannomas, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So then let's talk about neurofibromas. In the middle and right panels, I'm showing neurofibromas that the one in the middle panel is growing within, let's say, a small sensory nerve in the skin. So maybe that's a cutaneous neurofibroma. And the one on the right there is growing along multiple nerves. That's plexiform neurofibroma. So one thing to notice if we look at the histopathology in the bottom is that all 3 of these look the same. No, you're not just imagining that. It is not because you are not a pathologist in a lab. They all look the same. And I have multiple patients who come see me and say, I've had 3 tumors removed and 2 of them were X and the other one was Y. What condition do I have? Well, what's really going on is that sometimes the pathologist is only given a little bit of tissue and all they can do is describe what they see. And if it looks more on the side of a schwannoma, they call it that. If it looks more on the side of a neurofibroma, they call it that. And by the way, if the surgeon tells them ahead of time that it's a schwannoma or a neurofibroma, that ends up on the report. So you can't go just by the histopathology for that. The other thing to notice is that if you look at the number of nerve fibers that are inside the neurofibroma and even the plexiform neurofibroma, there's an awful lot because these tumors don't play by the rules. They grow in between and around all of the different nerve fibers. And a lot of times, if you talk to a surgeon about having one of these tumors removed, they say, well, we have to be extra special certain that it's not involving a major nerve that is going to control movement in your arms or your legs or one of the nerves leading from your brain out to your face or to your diaphragm. And that's because these tumors cannot be fully removed unless you cut the nerve. So yes, you heard that right. Neurofibromas and plexiform neurofibromas, more difficult to remove unless you cut the nerve. If it is a teeny tiny sensory nerve in the skin, you may have no symptoms from that. But if it's one of the nerves that's controlling your dominant hand, that could be a problem. So again, this is why location matters. So when I'm teaching my students, I tell them that NF means that the nerve has to be forfeited. Schwannomatosis means save the whole nerve. So on the top, we see the neurofibroma that's growing completely around all of the nerve fibers within the nerve, whereas the schwannoma on the bottom is on maybe 1 or a couple of nerve fibers and can be removed, we hope, safely. The other thing to note is that typically, and there's a lot of overlap between NF and schwannomatosis, I'm going to talk about later, but typically schwannomas can cause pain out of proportion to the size of the tumor. And I do run a resection clinic where I'll remove skin bumps in both NF and schwannomatosis. And I'll tell you, just recently I had a patient who was having such exquisitely severe pain in their leg. And when I went digging for this tumor, what I found was probably the size of a tiny little snail like you would have in your garden. And I showed the patient and they said, that's it? That's what's causing all of my severe pain? Yes. So schwannomatosis causes a lot of pain. And a lot of patients who I see with schwannomatosis also have a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. And we think that this is because some pathologic studies have shown that there are microscopic schwannomas within many nerves within the body, and that can cause a whole body pain that's difficult or impossible to see on imaging. And then this shows you again what has to be removed if you remove a neurofibroma versus a schwannoma. Here on the left, I have a patient with schwannomatosis. On the right, a patient with neurofibromatosis. The location of the tumors tends to be different. So in schwannomatosis, vestibular schwannomas are common. With NF2, they always occur in both of the hearing nerves. With other forms of schwannomatosis, they may or may not affect even one of the hearing nerves, although that is a possibility. And then schwannomas can also happen in the skin, although this is less common. it is, if somebody has a tumor in the skin, they're more likely to have a tumor in the skin, but it's not every patient that suffers from that aspect. And then they have scattered tumors. Some of them may be just right next to the spine on a nerve root. Some of them may be in the limbs. With NF1, there's much more strong involvement along the spine in the neck region, and then also in the lower back region. You frequently see tumors next to the spine, sometimes on both sides, that can grow in and press up against the spinal cord. And NF1 patients are far more likely to get tumors of the skin. NF1 patients are also at risk of low-grade brain tumors, which I'm showing in the image, and also tumors along the optic pathway. And NF patients can have these large plexiform neurofibromas, sometimes inside the body, sometimes involving a limb, that we typically don't see with schwannomatosis. Now I'm moving on to the genetics of NF and schwannomatosis. All of these genes are caused by mutation, which means the loss of function of one copy of the two genes that everybody's body relies on. And with NF1, that happens very, very early in development. We think probably in the sperm or in the egg before the embryo actually is formed. And that means that everybody who's growing up with NF1 has only half of the NF1 gene product that they need throughout their whole body. And that can be associated with other symptoms like a higher risk of ADHD and depression, anxiety. There's a long list I'm not going to get into. But for inheritance patterns, if you have NF1 and you have the clinical signs of NF1 and a gene is identified, or maybe it's not, there's a 50% risk that your children may inherit that particular gene mutation. And this is because when you form an egg or a sperm, each of those only has 50% of your genome. And then the way you make a baby is you add 50% from the father to 50% from the mother. They come together and they make a new individual. So everyone who has the mutation with NF1 gets the NF1 syndrome, and the gene is NF1. With NF2-related schwannomatosis, it's a similar picture. 50% of children will get the gene mutation on average, and everybody with a mutation gets NF2. But whoa, let's talk about other schwannomatosis. So here, remember, we know two of the genes associated with other schwannomatosis. We don't know the others. We don't know how many others are out there. But we do know that 50% of the children still will get the gene mutation that's responsible for the condition, but not everybody actually gets the condition. And the genes that we know of only represent, we think, fewer than 40% of the cases that we see. So there's still a lot to be understood about other schwannomatosis, but I, for one, don't routinely recommend genetic testing of children because even if they inherit the gene that we identify, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to see the growth of schwannomas. So let's talk about what causes tumor growth in NF versus schwannomatosis. On the left side, I'm showing a graph that shows that the NF1 protein inhibits this gene called RAS. And RAS works through a number of downstream proteins leading to MEK, and then ultimately that causes cell growth and division. In NF2 or other schwannomatosis, the gene that's responsible inhibits this very confusing web-like pathway called YAPTAZ that acts through cell death pathways, also MEK, also another one called AKT, to inhibit cell growth and division. So what happens if you lose your NF1 protein? Well, then RAS becomes hyperactive, more MEK is activated, and you see a lot of increased cell growth and division. And the reason that we don't see this affecting the whole body, but more specifically certain areas, including the nerves and GIST and pheochromocytoma, is just those cells happen to rely on this pathway more than others. So those are the types that are susceptible. Similarly, if you lose the gene for NF2, then you see the YAPTAZ pathway becomes hyperactivated. Now it can block the cell death pathway, so cells are more likely to survive, and it acts through MEK and AKT to increase cell growth and division. So the different treatments for NF1 and schwannomatosis logically are the ones that deal with the parts of the signaling chain that are hyperactive. So in NF, we have now 2 FDA-approved MEK inhibitors, and our sponsors are outside. I welcome you to go visit their booths and learn more about the 2 FDA-approved MEK inhibitors. We also have Pasithea here that has a clinical trial for a new next-generation MEK inhibitor, and it quite simply just blocks that pathway and blocks cell growth and division. For NF2, what we have that's not FDA approved is a drug called brigatinib, which has been used in lung cancer, but works through a different mechanism in NF2 and schwannomatosis. And that blocks a little bit of the multiple pathways that lead from YAP-TAZ to cell growth and division. So talking still about the differences between NF and schwannomatosis, these are some of the common characteristics that we see in NF1. We can see skin bumps called cutaneous neurofibromas. You can see birthmarks called capheolamacules, and I call them birthmarks. They look like birthmarks. They're not often or always present at birth. I would say not always present at birth. They can develop later on. Pheochromocytomas that Charlene Bishop talked about, GIST, which Charlene Bishop talked about, is a tumor involving the gastrointestinal tract. Scoliosis is common with NF1. This is curvature of the spine. Sometimes it can be very severe and can require surgical intervention in a child. This picture of the plexiform neurofibroma is a plexiform that involves the skin. Typically, these are very, very soft, almost pillow-like. The skin is usually a little bit darker colored there, and they can have unlimited growth potential throughout the life. And then leash nodules are freckles along the iris. There is a technical difference between leash nodules and actual freckles on the iris. An ophthalmologist would have to diagnose that. Schwannomatosis, common characteristics are quite different. With NF2, individuals are predisposed to meningiomas, also to vestibular schwannomas. In NF2, they occur in both the hearing nerves. In other schwannomatosis, possibly only in one or in neither of the hearing nerves. And ependymomas are these tumors within the spinal cord that if they become large and symptomatic, they do need to be removed, but we try not to do that because a lot of times they just sit there. And schwannomas, everybody with schwannomatosis by definition is predisposed to schwannomas of the peripheral nerves. So very, very different. A little bit more about vestibular schwannomas. The location that they grow in, what we're seeing here in the cartoon is the base of the skull. So the eyes would be on the top and the back of the head would be on the bottom. The ears would be on either side. And the cochlea is that sort of snail-shaped design on the left, just next to that big egg-shaped object. So the big egg-shaped object is a vestibular schwannoma. And what I want to point out here is that although we think it's growing from the hearing nerve, we know it's growing from the hearing nerve, the facial nerve is literally right next door in that tiny little canal that moves between the brain and the ear. And because of that, the tumor itself can damage the facial nerve, which can result in facial droop, or removal of the tumor, which may be medically necessary, can also do the same. And then cranial nerve 5, which delivers sensation from the face, is located right next door, and that's the one in red. And so also these vestibular schwannomas, they can press on that nerve and they can cause severe pain in the face. So on the right, I'm showing an individual who has facial droop, either as a result of a vestibular schwannoma or as a result of its removal. And on the bottom is a woman wearing what's called a baha, which is a bone-attached hearing aid. So you use bone conduction to bring sounds from one side of the head and conduct them over to the other side where the hearing nerve is intact. So if these two conditions are so very different, and I've spent all this time telling you how they're so very different, then why do we group them together? Why do we have people with NF1 and people with schwannomatosis in this room right now and listening to this talk? Well, one reason is that they both affect Schwann cells. So these are nerve tumor predisposition syndromes. And because they both affect the cell type, it turns out a lot of the people who study and treat these conditions are comfortable treating patients who have both types of conditions. Another is nerve pain. So patients with NF1, about a quarter of the time, have long-term, what we call, the word is chronic pain. Usually it's associated with the tumor, so we can do a scan and say, there's a tumor, it's pressing on these nerves, that's what's causing your pain. Although some patients who have had multiple surgeries or who had scoliosis, especially scoliosis that was repaired, can have chronic pain related to the procedure and related to the fact that their muscles throughout their whole lives are trying to keep that spine straight, and that spine is never going to be straight, and that can cause a lot of muscle stiffness and muscle pain. With schwannomatosis, 75% of patients have long-term chronic pain. And I'm not kidding you, I have patients who come to see me because they have a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, and many decades into their life, they finally get a scan and it shows that they have tumors that would be consistent with schwannomatosis. And I see this very frequently. Usually their pain is fibromyalgia-like, but you can also have pain that's associated with one particular tumor. And if that's the case, right now, the best treatment we have is to take that tumor out. This is a picture of skin conditions associated with NF. On the right, you see cutaneous neurofibromas, and this is a typical appearance. The literature shows that a parent and a child can have very different types of neurofibromatosis, and that's true. But I do also frequently see families who come in who have the similar types. You know, if the parent doesn't have a lot of skin bumps, the kid doesn't have a lot of skin bumps, or vice versa. And then also the basic size and shape of the neurofibromas can vary. Some people have ones like this that are pushing out. Other people have ones that are more under the skin. So the skin looks relatively smooth, but then maybe when they're exercising, you can see fine little bumps on their skin. There's a lot of variability. And the cafe au lait macules on the left that I'm showing, these are a sign of NF1, but there is never any chance that either the cafe au lait macules or the cutaneous neurofibromas will turn into cancer. Those will always be benign. The literature says something like 99.5% they won't turn into cancer, and that's just because if another condition is missed, maybe there's a melanoma lying underneath a cutaneous neurofibroma, then sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. This is an example of the skin of somebody with schwannomatosis, and these are showing some dermal or skin schwannomas. So these can be quite painful. People will say when they roll over at night, it really bothers them, or sometimes they can't even have their clothing touch their skin, and those can be removed, similar to deeper schwannomas. Both schwannomatosis on the left and NF can grow into what are called we refer to as barbell tumors. These are tumors that start on one side of the spine and can grow into the spinal canal and form this double-barreled appearance, looks like a barbell. And similar molecular pathways are at play. I think those of you who are paying attention might have noticed that MEK was in play in both schwannomas and neurofibromas. So there may be some clinical trials in the future that try to address multiple pathways in schwannomas, including MEK. Both of them can lead to sensory loss. With NF, typically what we see is vision loss due to an optic pathway glioma. With schwannomatosis, we can see hearing loss or vision loss if there's a meningioma that is growing right behind the optic nerves. Both conditions cause pain. Depression and anxiety are associated with both. Patients go through multiple surgeries and need a lot of support as far as, therapy, counseling, and just knowing they're not alone. And both of these conditions can change somebody's appearance. And so for these reasons, the physicians who treat NF and schwannomatosis welcome both cohorts into their clinic. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation, just one slide on gene therapy. So gene therapy is not yet an option for NF and schwannomatosis, and there are a couple of reasons why. The NF gene in particular is extremely long and complicated. You may hear a little bit about this again from our subsequent speaker, Dr. Wallace. That makes them difficult to edit. Also, mutations can happen anywhere within the genes. So for other conditions like cystic fibrosis, which has seen great success with gene therapy, sometimes with sickle cell, we've seen some success with gene therapy. The mutations happen in a couple of what we call hotspots. So you know that there's one region of the gene that's going to be messed up. And if you come up with a one treatment fixes all gene editing platform that just deals with that one mutation, then it can apply to many, many people. But with NF or schwannomatosis, the mutations can happen so many different places that you would have to have a validated therapy for each and every individual who has a different mutation. And that's very, very difficult to do, if not impossible. You would also have to deliver the gene therapy mechanism to every single cell within the body at ideally the same or near similar dose, and we don't have a good way to do that yet. Also, NF And NF1 and the NF2 genes, they have overlap with a lot of other genes that are really crucial. So with gene editing, if you're going to edit those genes, you have to make sure that you're not also affecting other genes that share similar codes. And then just finally, as a summary, the technology is not yet there. There may be creative ways around this, and I think this would be a good segue to Dr. Wallace. A few things about the NF and Schwannomatosis program. You probably get this, but we really, really care about you all. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing this for any other reason. We listen and we will address the issues that are bothering you. If we don't have an answer right now, we're going to keep looking. And when we do have an answer or a clinical trial, we're going to give you a call and let you know. We have amazing scientists here at UAB who are devoted to finding new treatments. We offer family visits. So if there are multiple family members who all have the same condition, we can accommodate that. We just need to know how many people and what ages. I see patients 2 and older. If there is a child 18 or less than 18 years of age who does need therapy for a plexiform tumor, that child will be referred to Dr. Metrock. We have a skin bump removal clinic in 90 minutes. We take off as many as we can, as many as you want. Now, if you only have one that you want to have removed, that's fine. Just let us know and we'll give you a shorter slot. We're also looking into bringing electrodesiccation to UAB. And because we're the NF Clinical Trials Consortium head, thanks to Dr. Dahl's involvement, trials open here before they open anywhere else. And that's a huge boon to everybody who lives in the area. You get first dibs on exciting new treatments and new trials. So I want to thank you. And we're going to, again, save questions for the end, but I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Wallace. Dr. Deanne Wallace is a PhD. She's a professor in the Department of Genetics at UAB. She has successfully utilized functional genomic approaches to lead a number of screening and drug discovery and development projects that have resulted in numerous publications, patents, a what's called an IND application, which is for developing a new drug. That's the first step, and lead compounds ready for clinical trials. Currently, her lab focuses on understanding the function of the NF1 gene and developing mutation-directed therapeutics, including something exciting I hope we'll hear about today called exon skipping. NF1 is characterized primarily by benign tumors that form along the nerves anywhere in the body. While the NF1 gene is a classic tumor suppressor mutation, the mechanisms involved in tumor growth are still poorly understood. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wallace.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So I'm on the dark side. Probably you've never seen me or met me because I hang out in the lab. And I want to preface my talk with, it's not just my lab here at UAB, but there are multiple labs here at UAB. And even from my lab, I see 5 of my students here. So it takes a lot of work to do the things that I'm doing. I collaborate internationally. So it's more than just my lab. It's more than just UAB. This is a lot of work that I'm going to tell you about. So I am going to tell you about some of the basic science research that we're doing in genome-guided therapy for NF1. So this, I wish I had a pointer, but I guess maybe I'll live without. Okay, so these are some of the phenotypes of NF1, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. What I like to bring about, or what I like to point out on this slide is, everyone, of course, is familiar with the hallmark feature, the cutaneous neurofibroma, and the plexiform neurofibromas as well. But those plexiform neurofibromas are the only feature that have FDA-approved therapeutics. So all those other phenotypes, there are things in clinical trials, but there is nothing FDA-approved for all of those other phenotypes. And I think that's a problem. I also like to back way up and remind people, remember, Dr. Brown was already telling you, remember, we have the egg and the sperm, and those come together to form the zygote, and the zygote undergoes cell division, and you get a multicellular human. And remember, it's multicellular, so within every cell is a nucleus with DNA, and that DNA condenses into chromosomes. And if you unspool those chromosomes, you find, actually, is there a pointer? Can I? See if I can use the mouse. Sorry? You can see the mouse? Okay, here we go. All right, so we've got there we go. All right, if we can see the mouse, I'm good. I'm good if we can see it. All right, so we've got our DNA. And one of the points I need to make when we start talking about molecular, whoops. Awesome. Okay, so DNA gets transcribed into RNA. The middle button. Am I not loud enough? I'm really loud and obnoxious. Let's look at both loud and obnoxious. All right, so DNA gets transcribed into RNA. You're pulling out your genes, that RNA gets translated into peptide proteins. No, that's not
I'm
gonna
told
work.
there are people online who need to hear.
Oh, okay. I'll do it from here. I'll use my mouse. I'll try to use it. Oh, okay. I can do my thing now. All right. Okay. So another way to view that same process is, here's our nucleus here. We've got our DNA in there and we transcribe that into RNA and we end up splicing RNA. I'll cover that in just a moment. But remember your RNA, if you remember from high school biology, gets read in triplet nucleotides and you get codons to build your amino acids to make your polypeptide chain. To string that out a little bit longer even and go into more detail, which we're gonna need this for some of our therapies, is if you've got a gene here on top, pretend that's your DNA, and there's exons and introns, and that gets transcribed into RNA, and your RNA undergoes a process called splicing to remove these little red bits. They're introns. They're not really part of the expressed genome. So we remove those introns and then we can get it translated into our amino acid chain, which then folds up into a three-dimensional peptide structure. All right, and I also like to remind everybody about the differences between somatic and germline, right? Because we were talking about germline, the NF1 and the NF2 genes are in the germline, and so they get passed on to your children. But when we start talking about therapeutics, we really want to start targeting things that are somatic, so other parts of the body, because we're not comfortable enough yet with what we're doing to your genome to want that to go into future generations. So we try to avoid germline gene therapies. All right, another thing I like to do is go through some different types of mutations, right? We've already covered how NF1 has like 4,000 different pathogenic variants within it. So there's different ways to make those mutations. And so if you imagine, while your DNA is really A, T, G, and C, we've just written it out as protein for simplicity, but you can imagine if you change a letter, that's a missense mutation. And there are certain therapeutics that are good for missense mutations. If you truncate your protein, right? If you cut it off with a premature termination codon, you can use nonsense suppression therapeutics to go in and try to fix those. And that's something that we've got going here at UAB and Dr. David Bedwell's lab. You can, of course, delete little bits, you can insert little bits, or invert little bits, or you can insert little bits. And so each one is slightly different, and each one gives us a different opportunity to go in and fix it. And so what I mean by different opportunities is if we think about things like, hey, we've got DNA, it's transcribed to RNA and translated into protein. Well, at the DNA level, there's different types of therapeutics. We can do genome editing, which Dr. Brown mentioned. Hey, that's really difficult for NF1 because there's 4,000 different variants, so we need 4,000 different therapeutics to treat that. We can do gene replacement. Dr. Brown already mentioned that at least for NF1, that's really difficult because it's just too big. But for NF2, maybe it's not too big. NF2 is smaller. If you look at the RNA, you can edit RNA, just like you edit DNA, you can edit RNA. And we've got several approaches that we're working on here at UAB. And we can modulate splicing using something called antisense oligonucleotides. And that's something that my lab does a lot of. So my lab focuses primarily here, but I'm dabbling in all the others. At the protein level, we can look at the level of translation, and we can convince, if there's a premature termination codon, we can convince the translation machinery to keep going and try to get past that. We can do protein replacement. There are other genetic diseases where, hey, you're missing your protein. We just give you the protein. Doesn't work so well for NF1, but that's okay. And then there's modulators. This is really famous from the cystic fibrosis world, but we're working on modulators for NF1 too. So I'm going to go through each of these kind of stepwise and tell you what's going on and what's good about it and what's bad about it and kind of where we are in the lab. So the first one, everyone in the room has heard of CRISPR genome editing, right? Everybody's excited about CRISPR, right? Well, what's required for CRISPR is you have an enzyme that you have to get into the body, and that enzyme cuts DNA. And you can tell it where to cut. You can program it, right? Because you give it this guide RNA. And so you kind of put in the sequence that you want to target, and that guide RNA binds, and then you get the enzyme to cut your DNA. Your genome hates being cut up. It's really bad for your genome. So your genome does everything that it can to get that DNA back together. Gaps are really bad in your DNA. So primarily, 90% of the time, it uses a process called non-homologous end joining, and that's just forcing the DNA strands back together. And it's not very faithful to the original sequence. So you almost always get small insertions or deletions, or there's problems there. That's not what you want to do to treat someone. You're not going to repair a mutation by putting in more. So we try to push it towards homology-directed repair. We can provide donor DNA templates, or we can actually program in ways to, copy that in or replace it properly, but it's really low efficiency. So that's kind of a problem. So in terms of where we are, like broadly, clinically, this year, this made international news. This is KJ. KJ was born at CHOP and has amino acid mutations in the carbamyl phosphate synthase gene. So he has a very, very severe disease that is pretty much lethal, all right? But scientists at Penn were able to develop CRISPR enzymes and deliver them to the liver, right? So it's KJ's liver. All right, NF1 has other issues like neurons, which are much harder to target. But they were able to replace a little bit, enough of his CPS1 gene in his liver such that with other therapeutics, he's doing okay, as opposed to not being alive. So this happened in 6 months. And so now you're looking at me like going, okay, so 6 months from now, I'll have my gene editing for NF1. And I'm sorry, I can't do that. Because it's really low efficiency, and we're trying to target neurons primarily, and Schwann cells and maybe other cells, depending on which phenotype you're having trouble with. In addition, Dr. Brown already mentioned that there can be non-specific gene editing, right? There's other genes that are related. Each guide that we use is for one individual mutation. So if there's 4,000 mutations, we need 4,000 different guides. And we still require that exogenous protein, that CRISPR enzyme or some other base editing enzyme that's still got to be provided. And while it's good and bad, it's permanent, right? It's good because, yeah, it's permanent, one and done, but it's bad because, well, what if it's still not quite right? So, but it's easy to design those guide RNAs, and it's low cost. We've been trying this a little bit with NF1. We can do it easily in cells, but getting it in vivo, we've been trying to use nanoparticle delivery, and it's just really not very efficient, and it's not going so great, and it's just really difficult. All right, gene replacement. Probably better for NF2 than NF1, but remember, this is where you have your gene with your mutation in it, and so you just provide a whole new gene, right? And typically that's done with virus, right? Currently, that's almost always done with virus in the clinic. And so then, what's nice about this is that you provide the whole gene, so it's mutation agnostic, right? So it's one therapy for every patient, as opposed to 4,000 different therapies. So that's nice, but virus, actually, remember how tiny viruses are. Viruses are even smaller than bacteria, and we just literally cannot get the whole NF1 gene packaged into that virus. So we're trying modified viruses that will accept more DNA. We're trying lipid nanoparticles because those don't really have a end or a carrying capacity limitation. So we're trying other things. But clinically, There are multiple gene therapies out there that do this gene replacement. Luxturna is one of them. It's for a form of blindness where you have mutations in the RPE65 gene. And they basically package that gene into a virus, directly inject it into the retina. And so actually the retina is really easy to get to compared to, say, an optic pathway glioma, right? So that's targeting the retina or the liver are pretty amenable to those type things, and NF1 is not so amenable. So we're able to do that for certain diseases. And again, it targets all the mutations, so that's great. Unfortunately, it's also pretty inefficient. You don't get it in every single cell, so you're getting it in a few cells. And if you rescue a few cells, that's great for some diseases, but maybe not so much for NF1. It's still at an early stage clinically. It's complex and costly to manufacture, and that payload, how much gene you can fit in there, it's just limited. We are trying gene replacement. We've got cDNA vectors, we've got synthetic DNAs. We're optimizing the DNA sequences for those and trying to get them in using nanoparticles, and we've been trying to use different animal models to do that. But we're trying, it's just, we gotta have tricks. So this is representing RNA editing, and this is particularly by ribozymes, but we're also using a technique called spliceosome-mediated mRNA transsplicing, but it all involves the RNA. So remember, you've got your nucleus with your DNA, and then you make your RNA, but your RNA has a mutation in it, right? So what happens is you can use a ribozyme or other things. So this is the ribozyme. It's just an enzyme that's going to allow you to splice your RNA or to cut your RNA and stitch it back together, basically. And so you can program that to go to a particular spot in your genome, and we can program it to NF1. And then this has the activity to basically cut off the mutation part and then add in the good part that you want, the corrected part. And so we have been able to do that, and we've been able to do it in cells. And the nice thing is we're not changing the DNA, right? So this isn't permanent, and that's a good and bad thing, right? It's not going to be a one and done. You have to constantly do this, but we're getting really low efficiency. Like I'm seeing like 1 to 2% splicing, and I need much more than that to have an effect and restore NF1. It's non-permanent. Again, that's good and bad. There can always be off-target effects, and it's at the early stage clinically. There is one splicing therapeutic in phase 1 trials right now. And so this is kind of a novel technology that isn't really well known or well appreciated. So it's kind of hard to get funding for it because they're like, oh no, it's too inefficient. But we're working on ways to increase that efficiency. And like I said, we've got it working in cells. We've just got to get it better. All right, and so I mentioned that spliceosome-mediated transsplicing. So this is just an example of, you've got your mRNA, you've got your exons and your introns. Right, and this spliceosome, it's just a complex of proteins that live in your cell, and they go in and they bind certain spots, and they just cut out that intron and splice together the exons. And we need that for exon skipping or antisense oligo treatments. And so here I've depicted a gene with 6 exons, and I said, hey, let's imagine a pathogenic variant in exon 4. And we can trick that splicing machinery. We can basically mask where the spliceosome would bind so that maybe it won't bind, right? And so what happens is we get a truncated and hopefully functional polypeptide. And so my lab actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out which NF1 exons could be removed and keep a functional NF1 polypeptide. And that was actually I think the trickiest part, or one of the trickiest parts for exon skipping. And so, clinically, Spinraza, you may have heard of for spinal muscular atrophy. This is another pediatric disease, neurodevelopmental disease that affects young children. Spinraza and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy both have FDA-approved antisense oligo-based therapeutics. These antisense oligos actually perform really well clinically. They're tolerated quite well by patients. And so what's also really nice about these is when you think about drugs historically, there's only so much of what we term the druggable genome, right? So there's only so many proteins that you can actually get a drug to bind and kind of fix or modulate. But, and that's, I think that's like 25% of all the genes or proteins out there. But now if we've got antisense oligos, we can target any gene, all of them. So we now have new targets by going in and using these antisense oligos, and they're not terribly toxic. They've got reduced toxicity, and they're FDA approved. And so actually there are, the FDA is trying to do approval pathways that are expedited for some of these antisense oligos because they're so well tolerated. Unfortunately, they aren't particularly stable. You need repeat applications of these, although I am reading that they're for Duchenne's, they're trying to get up to like 4 to 6 months. So that's actually not so bad. Getting them into the body is a little hard. Getting them into the cells is a little hard. I'll go through that in just a little bit. And once it's in the cell, getting it to the right place in the cell is also hard. And then you can always have off-target effects. And so for NF1, that's primarily what my lab's been doing. We've identified multiple target exons that we can skip, and we've been able to go ahead and generate antisense oligos, and we've been giving them to mice. We can show skipping in the mice. We can show skipping in NF1 relevant tissues. But next, we've really got to prove that it's effective at reducing tumors. So we're getting it in, we're getting the skipping, and I was really excited. I had a clinician actually tell me, you know, that's why it's so important that we work together with clinicians, and even though I'm on the dark side that I surface sometimes, but because a clinician said to me, it's like, hey, if you give it to a patient, how are you going to know it's working? Right? Like I can't go in and biopsy a kid's brain, right? Like nobody's going to let me do that, and they shouldn't, right? So we found out that we can actually detect skipping in blood. So I can just take a blood draw and then look at extract the RNA and then just, oh, look, I see skipping. So that's a really good biochemical on-target assay for us. So we're excited about that. All right, David Bedwell's lab here at UAB has spent 20, 30 years doing, looking at translation. And he has really pioneered this field for both cystic fibrosis, and we've convinced him to do NF1. And so what normally happens when you translate a protein is, so you've got your mRNA here and you've got your normal stop codon. All right, and so your ribosome, that's the gray bits here, the ribosome comes in, and once you hit that termination codon, translation terminators come in, and they basically, you know, remove the ribosome from the complex, and it leaves your full-length polypeptide, right? So you've got a great protein there. But if you have a premature termination codon, so you've just changed one DNA base, and now when your ribosome's reading it, it goes, oh, wait, I'm supposed to stop here. And so it does. And then you don't get your full protein, and that's bad for you. So what David Bedwell's lab has figured out is he's figured out ways to trick the ribosome or to get rid of these translation terminators so that you go ahead and you put in another amino acid here. Maybe it's the right one, maybe it's not, but it allows you to keep going. And so you still make a peptide, and that's hopefully is functional and allows you to keep going. So this actually has been put on the market and is FDA, I don't think it's maybe FDA approved for Duchenne's. So ataluren for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and maybe CF. It's not particularly efficacious, but I think they see some measures of improvements. But it is in the clinic. And so what's nice about these nonsense suppression therapeutics is when you look at all mutations across the entire genome, across human disease, it turns out that about 11% of them are these premature termination codons. So that means you could cure 11% of all genetic disease, which is great. They're also small molecules. So let me back up. What do I mean? So it's something small like this. It's a small chemical compound, right? It's not a big protein. It's not a virus. You don't have to package it into a virus. It's not a whole gene. It's a small little doodad. Okay, so that helps. And that gives us some interesting things, right? It's a small molecule. So if I give it to a patient and they don't tolerate it, I can either back off the dose or I can remove it and it goes away. Your body metabolizes it and then it kind of washes out. So that can be an advantage. Sometimes not always, but you can repurpose. So, you know, ataluren, there have been some manuscripts in the literature looking at ataluren for NF. So there's other things we can do with it. And so what you do for one disease may apply to other diseases, so we like that. It can be combined with a thing called nonsense-mediated decay inhibitors. And so actually, when you have that RNA transcript and there's a mutation in it, your cell knows that there's a mutation, and so it wants to get rid of it. It degrades that transcript. So that can be a problem, but there are inhibitors, so you can combine the nonsense suppression with the nonsense mediated decay inhibitors. But the problems are that it's really low efficiency. That ribosome really doesn't want to put in the wrong amino acid. It really does want to come off the chain there. So it's low efficiency. We're trying to improve it. You can have off-target toxicity effects. So typically, one of the best known read-through agents are aminoglycosides. Those are antibiotics, and they happen to poison like the inner ear hair cells and some other things. So they're not great clinically, but we're working on reducing that toxicity. And then the other issue is the genomic context matters. And what do I mean? Well, it turns out that the 3 amino acids upstream and the 3 amino acids downstream can influence whether or not that read-through actually occurs. And we don't know the rules yet. We're trying to figure them out. David Bedwell's working on that, but he just hasn't gotten there yet. But he's made incredible progress. It turns out that 20% of NF mutations happen to be these premature termination codons. And he's shown in mouse models that he can raise the NF1 levels enough to prevent some phenotypes. And so we're really excited about that. There are some other approaches that I just wanted to touch on briefly. Dr. Brown mentioned that NF1's job is to inhibit RAS. Well, what if we could find a little bit of peptide, a little piece of, like NF1's huge and only 10% of it interacts with RAS. What if we could find a little peptide that could go and bind RAS and mimic NF1, right? So what if we found a mimetic? So I'm working with a chemist at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's found some peptides that do inhibit RAS, and so we've been testing those in the lab in cell lines, and we're pretty excited about those. And then NF1 modulators. I've actually got a student here that's been doing a high throughput screen for modulators, and we found a compound that we think increases the stability of NF1 mRNA. And so that would work great. Think about haploinsufficient cells. So cells where you only have one copy of NF1 missing, but you've got one copy that's there. Well, if I increase that copy's mRNA, hopefully I can make up for the missing stuff on the mutant allele. So that would be nice. And then we're looking at other ways to modulate NF1. We know that there are special, let's call them tags on the protein sequence that send it to pathways for degradation. Like all your proteins in your cell, eventually get degraded. They get sent to the proteasome is what we call it. Well, what if we modulated those tags in NF1 so that it didn't get sent to the proteasome as often? Then we could stabilize the NF1 protein. And so we're working on things to do that as well. Now, the other thing my lab is doing is we are working at my lab, Bob Kesterson's lab, who was at UAB and has now moved, and also John Perrant's lab, who's at UAB. We have, between us, we have a collection of the most patient-specific NF1 rat, mouse, zebrafish, and IPS cell lines, right? And so what do I mean by that, and why do we need it? So if you are trying to develop a nonsense suppression therapeutic, you need a stop codon in the mouse, rat, fish, or human cell line. You can't just use some of the other techniques to just inactivate a gene. You need very specific mutations. And so Bob Kesterson and John Perrant have spent a lot of time making rats and mice and zebrafish with patient mutations so that we can test drugs on those, test mechanisms on those. We can use cell lines to generate cerebral organoids. And so this is an example of some of the cerebral organoids grown in my lab. And those are like little brains in a dish, or like a little piece of brain in the dish. And so we can use those cell lines that way. And then from some of the rat tumors, we've been making tumoroids so that we can now study what's going on in cell culture. We can hold a lot of variables constant and just study a few little things going on. So we've got lots of next generation models, but there are many challenges with NF1. We've already mentioned the different phenotypes, and each phenotype comes from the loss of NF1 in a specific cell type, right? So like the cafe au lait spots are, loss of NF1 keratinocytes, neurofibromas, loss in Schwann cells, and so each one has a different cell type. And so delivering gene therapies to those cell types is problematic, and we got to pick one, right? There's different cells. The other issue, which is the issue for every gene therapy, is delivery. And I've drawn this schematic basically of different ways to get things inside your cell, right? Because eventually you've got to get your gene therapy inside the cell. And so your cell is covered with a cell membrane that's this lipid bilayer, and its whole function in life is to keep things out, right? So now we're trying to get things in, so we've got to trick it. Now, if you've got a small molecule like those nonsense suppression therapeutics, those can kind of permeate through the cell membrane. They're small, they can wiggle through. But if you need to get something larger in, maybe a cell-penetrating peptide that kind of bores a hole in the membrane, or a channel. Virus can actually fuse with the cell membrane and deliver its contents, and the same with nanoparticles. They fuse with the membrane and deliver their contents. So delivery to whatever your cell type of interest in is always, always a problem. And we also have the problem of how much NF1 do we need to restore? So ultimately, we don't really know, but I can tell you what we do know. I can't give you a firm number, but we know that you already know that patients with the same mutation, like in a family, they have different phenotypes, right? So that's going to confound whatever we think anyways. We also know that if we take fibroblasts from patients with different mutations, they can have anywhere from 12% to 89% neurofibromin expression levels. And you're like, wait, that goes against what we've learned in genetics, right? Like if you're missing a copy, you have 50% left, right? Your wild type is still expressing 50%. Well, NF1's complicated. So actually NF1, the protein itself dimerizes. And you can imagine that if you have a mutation that is preferentially sent to the proteasome for degradation, it now acts as a sink. Like if it binds a wild type, it degrades itself and the wild type. So we can have that situation going on. And then further, some mutations, like a missense mutation, it may be pretty stable, but just not functional. So just because it's there doesn't mean it's working. So these are some of the problems. Protein expression levels, don't necessarily equate to function, right? So we also know from mouse studies that if you have at least 50% NF1, you can rescue some phenotypes, but you don't necessarily rescue all the molecular phenotypes, like phospho-ERK levels are still elevated. We know everyone is always told how NF1 inhibits RAS, but there are RAS-independent functions, and my lab does a lot of study on some of those independent functions. NF1's a huge protein, and only 10% of it interacts with RAS. So what else is it interacting with? And so we study some of that as well. Some of the studies, the cell line studies from David Bedwell's lab, he's done some really exquisite studies where, he's working on that nonsense suppression therapeutics, and he's shown that if he can increase NF1 by like 5%, if he can get 5% normal levels, then he can impact GTP RAS levels and phospho-ERK levels. So these are just all molecular downstream things, and he can reduce those by half. So that's pretty encouraging, right? If we can get just a little bit of NF1, we can improve things. So we're excited by that finding. And then timing and risk for NF1. All right, so when would be the best time to initiate treatment for a patient with NF1? Do you want to give prophylactic treatment? Well, that might be hard because you never know what phenotype they're eventually going to develop, right? So, it's tricky. And then age of onset and variability in severity are kind of confounding as well, right? So plexiform tumors likely develop very early in life, and those are the ones at risk for forming MPNSTs. But then the cutaneous tumors, they develop later in life, but they're benign, so they're not typically as risky. And we also know that different phenotypes carry different risk, right? So how do you deal with that? And then the different approaches to gene therapy carry different risks. Like I would be very comfortable taking a nonsense suppression therapeutic because it's already been clinically approved for other diseases, but I might not be so comfortable with a gene replacement strategy where I'm injected with virus. It's complicated. And so all of that to say it is really complicated, but my goal is still to end NF. I have not thanked all of my collaborators or all of my lab members because they're just so very numerous that just know that it's more than just me. I'm not the only one leading these, but I do have a lot of federal and foundation support, and I need to thank them. And with that.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. My mind is blown, and I'm not kidding. Now is the time for break and or question and answer. If you have a question written down on a card, would you raise that up, please? And then I would ask our genetic counselor volunteers to come grab it. If otherwise, are there questions? If you have a question you want to ask, we can bring around the microphone. And then I would ask Ms. Bishop to come up, and Dr. Dahl and Dr. Wallace.
So my son has an NF2 diagnosis. When he was first diagnosed at the age of 15, the doctors that treated him told us that they thought he had NF1 and NF2 at the same time. We've had doctors in his medical care that have told us absolutely there's no way he can have NF1. And he has an official NF2 diagnosis. But I'm just wondering, he has had cafe Olay spots, which were completely misdiagnosed at a dermatology level where we live. And most recently, I've noticed he has eye drooping in his left eye. And I'm just wondering, is there any possibility that there is a patient that could have both NF1 and NF2, even if one is more predominant than the other?
I'll take this one. There is a lot of clinical overlap between NF1 and NF2. And as doctors, many of us memorize algorithms for how to diagnose. And that algorithm for NF1 includes cafe au lait spots. And the algorithm for NF2 does not. But we do see cafe au lait spots in NF2. And so it becomes challenging because the diagnosis of these conditions right now is mostly clinical. And the genetic work sometimes comes as a follow-up. Really, the ultimate answer is going to come from the genetic diagnosis. And then also we can look at any tumors that were removed and do genetic analysis of those to be sure. But to me, it sounds like it's NF2. And it's just another good reason to seek care at a center of excellence where we can understand the subtleties and just not go by, the paragraph in the diagnostic guide.
Thank you. And you mentioned fibromyalgia. And I mean, that's never come up in my son's diagnosis, but he does suffer a lot from pain. He does have tumors in his left eye that are pretty much inoperable because he would lose leg function if they were operated. So he would have to really be unable to walk before they would even consider surgery on that. But in our journey, we've never been confronted with possible suffering from fibromyalgia. Is there some sort of diagnosis for that in addition to his NF2 diagnosis?
There's no formal diagnosis for fibromyalgia. People who don't have NF2 or NF1 who are walking out in the world can have severe pain, and we don't really understand why. But with NF2, we do think that it's nerve dysfunction. And sometimes with NF1, patients can have primary nerve dysfunction as well. But the diagnosis is, if somebody says, I have pain all over my body and we don't see a tumor there, we look for other causes. And if we don't find them, then we say that's a fibromyalgia-like pattern. But also just coming from a doctor's standpoint, I think a lot of us don't understand fully what patients are going through because we don't routinely ask. And I'm trying to push, a lot of us are trying to push physicians to ask more. Are you having migraines? Are you having pain? Where is your pain? Has your pain changed? How is your digestion? Are you having bowel movements? All of those questions could be part of our everyday visits, and I think should be, but not every doctor knows to ask.
Just from experience with neurofibromatosis, some of my tumors are painful and some of them are not. I do have pain on a daily basis. When you go into a doctor, even for someone who doesn't have neurofibromatosis, and they'll say, "Are you having any pain today? What is your pain level? What would you say?" And for me, even though I'm hurting, you just get used to it. It's your daily life. It's what it is. And I have even let things go because of my pain. For a while, I was having some pain in my abdomen. I said, "Oh, it's probably a neurofibroma." And it ended up, my gallbladder was only working 18% because I put that off. I pushed that pain off. I'm not on any kind of pain medication at this time because I know at some point I'm going to have it. So I push that. I've never been told I've had fibromyalgia or anything like that, but I do suffer from pain on a daily basis. With the surgery that I had off my face, to push it, like when I have my hair done, when I go to the salon and she's washing my hair, it is painful on this one side. I had surgery in this past March again because the tumor that I spoke of earlier is starting to grow back. A great surgeon at Perkin Clinic, I was referred to through Dr. Brown. They did try to go in and remove some more of the tumor, but there's some kind of mechanism that they use to trace the nerve as they're doing the surgery. The closer he got to removing what he wanted to, it started letting him know it's too close, it's too dangerous. And I knew going in, that was the second time. The first surgery that I had, it was very scary because I was told that when they go in there and if they were to damage that nerve, then this side of my face would droop. It would be like having a stroke. But it was so much bigger than what it is now. And they didn't completely take it off. They shaved as much as they could of the tumor without going into the damaging the nerve. So we do suffer from, and everybody's different. I have a cousin that's Downs, and I've met a lot of Downs children. I've worked with Downs children. We each have it's a different severity. Mine may be different, from his. You can see, I do have some drooping here. I look a lot like some of the pictures that were shown here. And the depression and the anxiety comes from having the disorder. People, it's society, it's this world we live in that looks at the outside and not in the inside, not who you are. And I've met a lot of beautiful people in this world, and then when you get to know them, they're not so beautiful. I've met some very handsome men who on the outside look great and handsome. You get to know them, they're not so handsome. And, there's very few ladies, there's a lot of women in this world, but very few ladies. There's a lot of men in this world, but very few gentlemen. And those of you that have children, young children, or thinking about it, teach your children compassion. Teach them not to point. Teach them not to stare. Because you know what? You never know. God creates us who we are. He's created our beauty, and it can be taken away from us through an accident, through our health. And then what do you have left? It's who you are inside. It's your character.
So I have 4 kids, and my youngest was the one who was diagnosed with NF1 early on. And Dr. Brown was talking about inheriting the trait. So my question is that, will my 3 older kids need to be tested for NF? Because they're young adults now. And if there is a need for the testing, where is a good place for it to be done here in Birmingham? The 3 did not I don't know, but my pediatrician did not advocate that before, like, your older kids need to be tested. We just concentrated on my youngest because she was exhibiting, most of the signs and symptoms related to NF1.
I'm sure there are official guidelines for this that I don't know offhand, but what I would say is that if neither parent has signs of NF1, the diagnosis used to be entirely clinical, then most likely her mutation was sporadic, which means it happened in her and not in the other children. But genetic testing is offered and is many times covered by insurance. And your children are adults. And so they can certainly make an appointment with genetics to have their blood tested. And that would be with our genetic service. We have a genetic counselor who specializes in doing the family trees and in sending the blood. And you can call the number on the card that's included in the folder there, and we can get you set up or your children set up with that genetic counselor.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, good morning. Here's my beautiful NF1 baby right here. We have a question. She has the optic glioma, so lost vision in her eye at 2 years old. Okay, so we've grown up, very normal to her. Is there any kind of study going on that will possibly restore vision to those who have optic gliomas? Is that a chance in any of the future? I mean, it may not be her, but anybody in the future, is that possibly?
They may know better, but I do know that the Gilbert Family Foundation has an entire portfolio of grants working on vision restoration. That doesn't mean that it's available yet or that it's possible yet, but they are working on that actively. So for sure that's in the works. I don't know if y'all know more.
I don't think we have any clinical trial at the moment to reverse the vision.
Okay, and just to piggyback just off that real quick, she got diagnosed at 2. We did chemotherapy for 18 months. Great, it shrank. 10 years later, started growing again. We did chemotherapy. Now we're coming up at 10 years again, and she's starting to have growth again. I know we've been told, wonderful Dr. Brown, that it more than likely after 30, nothing grows. I feel like my little freaky little girl right here, she likes to make mama crazy. She will make that happen. Is there anybody that's continuously grown? Tumors have continuously grown even after like, yeah, we got it. Then 10 years later, it comes back.
The answer in medicine is always yes. There are those individuals. That's one reason why we always recommend surveillance imaging. Even if we think the odds are extremely low, we don't want to take those odds. And so we'll keep an eye out on it. We are, and maybe Dr. Dahl can talk about clinical trials that are going on for new treatments for optic pathway gliomas, but the community is very interested in finding new treatments. And because the growth is usually very slow or stops, then there's time for those. Dr. Dahl, do you know of any clinical trials for optic pathway glioma?
So currently, we finished one trial for optic pathway gliomas through the consortium, which was with a MEK inhibitor called binimetinib. But what we have open is through a children's oncology group. These are the randomized trials with selumetinib, which is another MEK inhibitor. So we randomized between selumetinib versus chemotherapy. It was, I think, Dr. Metrock, do you remember, Katie, do you remember which trial closed, the NF or the non-NF one? So it was unfortunate so that we had one trial for NF patients and one for non-NF. The NF patients trial was unfortunately closed because of slow accrual. It is hard to convince families when it's randomized, half patients get chemotherapy, half patients get the molecular therapy, which is oral. You can take it at home. It can go either way. Some people want standard of care. Some people want experimental therapy. So nationally, we had to close the study down. Through the consortium, we had conducted a trial with everolimus, which is an mTOR inhibitor that was successful. We saw good responses. Unfortunately, it hasn't led to FDA approval, But I think the only, we can still treat with either everolimus or a MEK inhibitor if need be.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Hearing everybody talk, I'm going to be a loudmouth. Our family has been on a clinical trial, our son. So if you'd like to speak to me or my husband about what that's been like, he was a pediatric patient that enrolled on the selumetinib phase 2 trial when he was 10. He's now 20. He still takes selumetinib. He's doing well. That's not the case for everybody, but the vast majority have done well on MEK inhibitors. And related to the Gilbert family, if you aren't familiar with the Gilbert family, Nick Gilbert was Jennifer and Dan Gilbert's son, and he had brain tumors and optic tumors. He recently passed away, I think, 2 years ago. But the Gilbert family owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. They also have a significant business in Detroit. They're very wealthy, and they have put a lot of that wealth toward the really expensive research that other smaller organizations are not able to do because it's going to take that kind of funding to do the venture gene therapy and things like that. So anyway, and the last thing I'll say is, because I know nobody standing up here can say it, but I can, if you'd like to meet with your senators toward the end of the month before they vote on the reissue of all of those funds, that $25 million that's happening here at UAB, my son is affected by one of those studies that's currently halted, the bone study. So you better believe I'll be talking to my senators in a very respectful, diplomatic way, as I have every year. But I would really encourage others to speak to your senators too about how important this is to families like yours and mine.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's take a much needed bathroom break. There are snacks still in the back of the room, and you can also visit our sponsors' booths out in the main area. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Laura Katie Metrock. She's a pediatric neuro-oncologist here at Children's of Alabama who treats children with NF1 and Schwannomatosis who need medical intervention. She graduated from Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, completed her pediatric residency training, pediatric hemonc fellowship, and pediatric neuro-oncology fellowship at Emory University in Atlanta, and ultimately joined UAB and Children's of Alabama in 2018. Dr. Metrock is director of the UAB Pediatric Neuro-Oncology Fellowship Program and director of the Alabama Center for Childhood Cancer and Blood Disorders Pediatric Neurofibromatosis Tumor Clinic. She serves as the co-chair of the Quality Assurance Committee for the NF Clinical Trials Consortium and course co-director of the National Children's Tumor Foundation Virtual Case Conference. She is also a CTF Clinical Care Advisory Board contributor. Her research interests are focused on clinical trials for children with tumors associated with NF1 and Schwannomatosis, including NF2. Dr. Metrock is also a member of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network Central Nervous System Cancers Guidelines Panel. So please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited we're back in person again after years of being virtual. I love having people get together and talk about the thing that we're all working to improve. All right, so I've been tasked today with talking about why the specialists are needed, right? And I think a lot of people in the room have some ideas about that, but my goals today are to understand where the specialists come into play and how a multidisciplinary approach to care can help. Be familiar with some of the complexities by a few case examples of instances where it's been necessary for our patients to have more in-depth subspecialized care. And then briefly touching on what multidisciplinary clinics can look like, because they can look different at different institutions. And I think people have some expectations if you've been at one clinic and you're coming to another, and also what we're working on here at UAB. I have no disclosures today. All right, so between NF1, NF Schwannomatosis, it's about 1 in 2,000 people, which is considered rare, but I think that's actually somewhat common too. I think it just depends on how you look at that. But given that, it's always surprised me how much people don't know about NF and Schwannomatosis. But I look back at when I first started, and like some of the other people that stood up here before me have alluded to, we learn from a book, when we're in school, and that's necessary and it's foundational and it's important. But it wasn't until I actually started seeing patients with NF that it came out of a book, and I realized these are people's lives, these are people's children. This is a journey, and it's so much more than what we can read about. And so with that, I kind of give other people in the field of medicine a little bit of grace when I have a patient come to me, and my first thought is, oh, like, how did we not find this, earlier? And then I stop and I think, no, like, there's common things are common, and that's what they're used to seeing, and they don't have those experiences to pull from. And so to me, that's where understanding the diagnosis can become empowering to families and patients of when to seek care, so we don't put off some red flags that with some patients we'd say, oh, we can just watch that. But in some of our other patients, we say, no, maybe we shouldn't watch that. Maybe it's more than just a little bit of stomach pain, for example. So what we offer, comprehensive evidence-based care, evidence-based because we've seen the patients, we've seen what can come from these trials, and be able to guide families. We have the multidisciplinary clinics that I'm going to talk about. Advanced imaging interpretation is actually quite key. And again, that's going back to what I was just talking about. Radiologists are wonderful, but they are also behind a screen. They're looking at pictures and trying to understand. I think it really becomes important to bring that to life. Okay, yes, you're looking at an MRI of a brain, or you're looking at an MRI of an arm, but who's behind that? What are they experiencing? What has their journey been like up until they took this picture? Why did we get it? And then what do we need to do with what they're looking at? So it becomes more than just what's written on paper to them. They start to know our patients. And that's my favorite thing, is when I talk to a radiologist and they start talking about the patient's history to me, because they've seen that patient more times. I love that. I'm like, all right, this is what we're going for. This is a team approach. And then the psychosocial support, I can't understate the importance of that enough for our families and for me as the pediatrician side, watching these children grow with the diagnosis. What does that mean to them in their journey? So this isn't even all the subspecialties, but these are certainly subspecialties that we call upon frequently. And that's not meant to be put up here as, oh my goodness, we have to see all these people. Not every patient is going to need to see every person from these subspecialties, but as a clinic, our goal is to have providers identified that when we call them in this clinic, they're not having to learn about NF. They already know it. They know what their expectations are from our clinic, and we can get patients seen efficiently and with a good team approach. All right, so some case examples of where the specialty clinics came into play as a necessary means to help these kids. So, Neurofibromatosis. Case 1, 15-year-old young lady has NF1. She wants to wear blue jeans, but every time she puts on her jeans, it's painful. She has a skin lesion right at the waistline, and that's really frustrating for her. Some people might say it's just a pair of jeans. Like, who cares? No, like, it's hard enough to be 15, right? Adding on another layer of something else to have to deal with. What can we do for her to make that part better? Case 2, a 4-year-old boy has an F1, has an obvious plexiform neurofibroma, lives 4 or 5 hours away from us. Pediatricians watching it, families watching it. They've been seen one time, a long time ago. They know it's there. They think, is it growing? Is it not growing? What do we need to do next? And then case 3, 14-year-old teenager with NF1 fell, had some imaging done in an outside hospital, and they said, oh, you've got a tumor behind your knee. That needs to be biopsied. Gets referred to a surgeon, gets a surgery date scheduled. The family calls and says, wait, do we need, what is happening? Is this, they just got shuttled through a system, and is this really necessary for our child? So looking at neurofibromas, we've talked about these today. These are technically benign. I mean, upfront, benign Schwann cell tumors. So you don't have to know about all the different cells that are in this list, but the point of highlighting that is there's a whole lot of stuff happening within these tumors, which is what makes them hard to manage. There's 4 main subtypes that we talk about. The cutaneous ones are the ones on the skin that people can see. Subcutaneous are right underneath the skin. Nodular or diffuse plexiform. So when somebody comes to me with a plexiform, we look at it, and is it one that's really intricate and involved, or is there a more nodular type lesion, more discrete? And then the spinal ones that kind of run up and down the spine. So with cutaneous neurofibromas, they develop usually later in childhood or early adolescence. Again, Dr. Brown mentioned this, they don't undergo malignant transformation, so they don't turn into cancer, but they can cause a lot of disfigurement, a lot of discomfort, and they can be really itchy because of one of those cells I talked about, the mast cells, can make them really itchy and annoying. And I think it's important to know that we have more options for these patients now. And with Dr. Brown coming to us, we've actually opened up a whole new world of options. This is one of the things that she's very interested in treating. And I love to be able to tell patients that, because for a while we just didn't have as much. But for that 15-year-old, she was able to go get that taken off. It's just one more thing that she can wipe off her plate with a zillion other things in this world to worry about, right? With some of our patients who end up going into adulthood with more lesions, again, more and more options available for things that we can do to help if they want that. Some patients do and some patients don't. And I think that's another place of that shared decision making with each person. So plexiform neurofibromas, these are very common, and at least about half of patients have them, often present in early childhood. And that's usually when they're going to have their highest growth rate, is during those teenage years. We've talked about where they come from a lot of different nerves at once, and you have healthy nerves running in with these tumor cells, and they can grow along the whole length of a nerve and be very extensive. They can go into structures that are important, your airway, other organs pressing against the heart, bony destruction, and they do unfortunately have a risk of turning into cancer, about a 10% chance of turning malignant. So we have to watch these. For the case of the patient with the orbital plexiform, we can't just watch by looking. Once these have been identified, we do need to follow them, because they can run deeper. They can cause more problems. We need to see if it's pressing up against the bone. Is it causing issues with the eye? What kind of pressure is on the eye? So that's where this multidisciplinary team, the specialists, come into play. Child with an orbital plexiform needs to have an ophthalmologist. In my world, I really stress pediatric ophthalmology and even a pediatric neuro-ophthalmologist. And it's somebody who we, from our side, we really work with closely, who starts seeing a lot of our patients and understands what these tumors can look like and what they can do to help anticipate issues before they're irreversible problems. We have surgeons involved sometimes. Then there's also MEK inhibitors, which you've heard about today. In the past with plexiforms, we tried using what we call general chemotherapy, right? When people think about chemotherapy, those are medicines that we give for dividing cells. And they affect all kinds of dividing cells in your body, which are the reason people undergoing chemo have a lot of side effects, right? We tried using those for plexiforms and it didn't work. Partly it's because most plexiforms aren't growing very fast, and so they're not going to have that turnover. And then for other reasons, they just didn't take up the medicine and work the way that we wanted it to. Along come what we call targeted chemotherapy, and it goes after that mutation in MEK that we saw earlier today, which is great. That's not to say it doesn't have off-target effects and side effects, because it certainly does. And when families come to meet with us, it's one of the things we have to sit down and talk about is where's your tumor? What problems is it causing? What problems might it cause if it keeps growing or if it starts to grow? And then what are the side effects and what could that mean for your life? And so sometimes the best option is not to treat. Sometimes the best option is to watch. And that can be really hard. But other times we say this is more of a shared decision. Let's talk about it and we can start it, see how you do with this particular medication. And then other times it's a strong recommendation that we need to get started. And this is why. And so those kind of conversations with families, it takes a lot of understanding each person's journey and what each person's expectations are. And it's a long conversation, which again is the kind of conversation you need to have with a specialist. We manage these in our neuro-oncology clinic because we also have the system set up in place for if there's an issue. If there's a side effect, we have a number for families to call 24/7. They can reach a doctor at night at 2 a.m. if they wake up and they're worried about something that might have to do with their medicine, and we can help direct them. And so there's a lot that goes into these tumors, a lot that goes into the potential treatments. Surgical options are also on the table. They need to be discussed. In the past, People try to take them out. They can grow back. They can be very vascular, meaning that there's a lot of bleeding in the surgeries and they can have a hard time healing from those surgeries. Now we've coming up with some better techniques. We have interventional radiologists that can sometimes come in and help make the blood supply less so it doesn't bleed as much. So we start having a little bit more creativity with each patient, right? What makes the most sense for this patient? Is there some surgical techniques that then we can follow with a MEK inhibitor, for example? But again, that becomes a conversation that you as a patient and a parent are having with your very specialized team. And in general, when somebody comes to see me and Mike in clinic about these, we're not making these even unilateral. This is not just us. We've presented the case in a tumor board where we've had a radiologist. We've had our adult docs also look at it. We've had the surgeons there together, all talking about these images in one place and space to understand what might be the best options for each person. All right, the world of ANUPs and MPNST, which is a whole lot of letters. And, I think Dr. Brown had talked about the names of the people and making things difficult. I know the people that made this ANUP term, and I like to give them a hard time because it's tough. So an ANUP is an atypical neurofibromatous neoplasm of uncertain biologic potential. And we all pronounce ANUP differently. I've heard some people say NUPE, but anyhow, it's as lighthearted as that is, it's a serious thing that we have to recognize and address. And then MPNSTs, which are malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors. So with case one, a 14-year-old young lady comes in, has a neck plexiform, said, well, it kind of has been hurting. I noticed there's kind of a hard spot. Don't know what's going on with it. Case two, an 18-year-old man comes with persistent hip pain and leg pain. This individual was seen at an outside hospital and at an urgent care was told, oh, it's just back pain. Take some Motrin, see what goes on. Went back to same urgent care. They said, oh, you've got some sciatica. We're going to give you some gabapentin, see what happens there. Family calls and says, we've been trying to do what they've said. Pain keeps going. Again, they live several hours away, which is a barrier to care I see frequently. But there wasn't just, 18-year-olds don't get sciatica by itself, right? Like there needs to be more of a workup for that. And that ends up being an MPNST. So case number one with an ANUP, we think about what that is, that we look at a plexiform, we imaged that particular patient, this 14-year-old, and in the middle of the tumor, there was a harder nodule that had developed. And there's different ways of going about this, but in this particular case, we did what's called a PET scan, which is where people don't eat sugar the day before the test. It's a very specialized CT scan. We don't do them on everybody because it's radiation and we don't want to radiate people over and over again. But when it's necessary, we do that. And sure enough, this area that was a little bit harder and bigger was taking up that sugar. So we knew it was trying to do something more than the other part of the tumor. Met with our team of surgeons, said, look, this is the spot. We need you to go in. We need to take that whole spot out. And it was amenable to that. So they were able to go in, take this whole part out. And sure enough, it was what it had been an area of a normal plexiform, not causing problems, had tried to change and turn into a more aggressive part of the tumor. And it was an ANUP. It wasn't fully malignant, but it had some mutations in that tumor that were making it act more aggressively. And then luckily in that case, we took that part out and we could just keep watching. Patient we're years later, doing fantastic, no problems. Now with this other case, case two, this is tough. These are when these tumors can turn malignant. People can have MPNSTs that don't have NF, but it is more common in the NF population with, again, about a 10% chance of change from a benign tumor. Risk factors, areas of an existing plexiform neurofibroma, previous radiation therapy. Sometimes we can say, look at the gene mutation and recognize if it's a very significant gene mutation that might, those larger germline ones might have a higher chance. Again, same workup. We've got to image them PETs, biopsy and resection when we can. So what I tell my patients is we can't control if the plexiforms change, at least yet, but we need to watch, we need to be aware. And that's where, again, keeping in contact with the primary team is so important, to watch these before they change. And then as soon as they start to change, we can act quickly. That's important. So rapid growth, a change in quality, meaning it's getting harder, faster, pain that especially like pain that wakes people up in the night and it just persistent. It's really common for plexiforms to hurt when they get bumped. That's pretty normal. But we're talking about the pain that I just can't sit down. I can't do this. Every time it's doing something. Those are the ones we need to image quickly and address areas of concern. All right, switching gears. Vestibular schwannomas. So I had a patient, 10-year-old, known NF2, but they were told most patients with NF2, they don't really have problems in childhood, so they don't need to follow with anybody. Wait for they can get older first and then start worrying about it. And I hear things like, well, you don't want these kids to feel like they have something that they need to, that makes them different. We don't want to put them in that situation. They don't need to have a lot of appointments. And I can respect for sure where families are coming from when they feel that need to protect a child from a diagnosis. I understand that. But I also really want to work with the families on how do we both respect those wishes and also monitor safely and empower the child, because eventually that child becomes an adult and they have to recognize what's going on with them where they can advocate for themselves one day as well. And I don't want somebody who thinks that missing appointments as a child is okay, so I don't have to do it when I turn 21. Goodness knows when they're 21, they're going to want to miss if they can, right? And so really working with families on, no, if we know this diagnosis, let's do what we need to do to keep everybody safe and meet you where you're at with how you want to address these diagnoses. So with these kids, we would say, no, let's get MRIs and look and see if we have the schwannomas yet. We usually get a baseline of the brain and spine. And then from there, we determine how closely we need to follow with multiple, with MRIs every year, every couple of years. But these are examples of vestibular schwannomas. And at that point, we also need to involve a lot of other specialists, right? We need audiology. We need our hearing team. And I like for it to be, in my world, pediatric audiologists when we can, or audiologists that have special experience and interest with NF2 patients. We certainly have those on the adult NF2 side that we send some of our patients to who do a fantastic job. Then we also involve our ENT and our surgery team and early on so that they can keep following. And again, sometimes we don't need to do anything, but we need to keep watching. And as trial options open or we get more treatments for these, people that are plugged into the system can get those options faster. And that's what we want to be able to do. So these vestibular schwannomas are usually bilateral. They can cause ringing in the ears, hearing loss, balance. It's usually gradual and progressive hearing loss. So it's always a balance of each patient going through, what is the tumor doing, and what's the best intervention at that point. And we have Dr. Walsh here, who's gonna come up after me and talk a bit more about those kinds of things. And then at the bottom, I do want to highlight before I move on, the child life and psychosocial needs. As patients are losing their hearing, when they come to see me, I love to talk to my patients. I love to hear how they're doing, but sometimes they don't want to talk to me about all the different aspects of their life. And I understand that. Sometimes they need somebody who's not just their medical provider. They need the child life person who, depending on where they are developmentally, can play or just talk and work through some of those. We have our psychologist and neuropsychology team when that's helpful to patients that can continue to follow. All right, spinal tumors. 14-year-old with NF2, bilateral leg pain and weakness. This is one of those, sometimes kids just put things off. He wasn't telling anybody until it got really bad. And came in to get imaging. Sure enough, there's a tumor pressing right up against the spine. Called over to the family, and they said, yeah, this is a really active kid, and he won't get out of bed for the last several days. And those are the kinds of things we want our patients to tell us as fast as possible. Luckily, in this case, we were able to get him in, got his surgery, regained all of his strength, and he was doing quite well. But just important to know what we're dealing with and act fast. Schwannomas, meningiomas, ependymomas, those are all possible with these tumors, and we manage a lot of them surgically or just with observation if they're not causing problems. But again, that observation is so important because we want to see, is it irritating the spinal cord? Do we need to do something before it causes a problem? All right, moving to gliomas. 5-year-old girl with NF fails a school's eye screening. And they, called and they got them in for an eye exam a couple months down the road. And mom calls clinic and says, "Hey, is this okay?" No, it's not okay. We need to know what's going on now. So call up our neuro-ophthalmologist. He says, "I will see this person, the next day." Get them in with a neuro-ophthalmologist, get an MRI, find an optic pathway glioma that is causing vision loss. We need to start treatment now to save as much vision as possible. Case 2, 14-year-old, NF1, fell and hit his head. They did some imaging, finds the tumor. The outside hospital says, "I think we should biopsy this," and it's an adult hospital. So, this is an optic pathway glioma right here, thickening of the nerve. So on this side, I want to highlight normal optic nerve, and on this side, you can see a thickened optic nerve. These can get much bigger. These can extend all the way back. But everybody, we have to meet every patient where they are with their specific tumor. So these low-grade gliomas, about 20% of patients have them. Most of those are in the optic pathway, but certainly can be outside of the optic pathway. So the first case, patient had an optic pathway glioma, needed treatment. Not all of them do. If it's not causing problems, it's not causing vision loss, it might not need to be treated. The other patient that we talked about who kind of, what we say incidentally, found his brain tumor, people want to intervene. When they see things like that, they want to jump and do something. But if you know NF, that tumor is not causing, it could have been there for many, many years, not causing any issues. So really in that case, instead of rushing to a brain surgery, if it doesn't have any signs that it's a more aggressive type of tumor, the best thing to do for that patient is to watch. And we get MRIs over time and see what it's doing, making sure it doesn't cause any issues, that it's not trying to change. They may live their entire life with a tumor that never caused a problem, never needed a surgery, never had anything. But they have to be watched in case something happens, in case something needs to be done about it, and then the team is ready and in place to act quickly. There is an increased risk of developing high-grade gliomas, which is another reason to monitor these. And we need to act very quickly if it looks more aggressive. This is just going through the surveillance recommendations. So every patient with NF should have an ophthalmology screen every year until they're 8 years old. If we know they have an optic pathway glioma, then we recommend they be seen every 3 months for an eye exam for the first year, and then we can start spacing out those exams after that, and then imaging every 3 months when we first find the tumor, and then we can start spacing out again after that. And that's a lot because a lot of these patients do need to be sedated for those scans. We don't take that lightly, but we also want to preserve vision as much as possible. These are other tumors that have been talked about today that are possible. And again, just having teams in place that are listening for those problems that might be red flags to say, we need to get imaging on that. We need to look at that. Breast cancer, we need to screen for that early. Being plugged in with the clinics help move through all of these types of issues faster, more efficiently, and that makes a difference in care. Same thing here. We don't have to go through all of these, but bony abnormalities, scoliosis. I see this a lot. So a 3-year-old with NF and newly discovered scoliosis. The most common reason patients have scoliosis is just because they're at risk for scoliosis, right? But in our world, we also want to make sure that there's not a plexiform or something pushing against that spine causing that. So if we see enough scoliosis, we know we need to go ahead and add on an MRI of the spine, make sure we're not dealing with anything that we need to be following and that could be addressed in a different manner with potentially a MEK inhibitor or that sort. So very common in NF. It sometimes can be treated with bracing. It doesn't respond as well to bracing as patients that don't have NF, but it might also need surgery. And again, MEK inhibitors may play a role if there's a plexiform pushing on that spine. Tibial dysplasia. So a mom thinks her infant has a leg that looks a little different, and she thinks she's seeing some birthmarks. So we need pediatricians to think through this case and say, this kid has more going on, they need to be seen, because they could have something like tibial dysplasia. And that's where we have bowing of the leg bone, and it can cause a lot of fractures, a lot of problems as with gross motor development as they get older, if that's not tended to at a place that is very familiar with tibial dysplasia and NF1. This is a long list, and it's mostly to be comprehensive in terms of being aware of if there's a murmur, we need to evaluate it in patients with NF. There is a higher risk of having cardiac malformations. Vasculopathies, meaning where the blood vessels didn't form quite the right way. So kidney, renal kidney, or artery stenosis that goes to the brain, aorta, your big blood vessel can be thin. And we need to be thoughtful of that when patients come in with symptoms. So any kind of new neurologic issues, we need to be thinking about, is this a vascular issue? Could it be a tumor? How do we need to work that up? Unexplained high blood pressure definitely needs to be looked at. Patients, essential hypertension just means it's more common. There's nothing that's actually causing it. It's an underlying issue. So higher blood pressure is more common in NF, but we can't just attribute it to that. If these blood pressures are running higher and higher, we need to do a workup for other issues like if the blood vessels are really thin to your kidneys, then your kidneys actually send out signals and it makes the pressure higher to try to get blood flow. Or you can have something that we talked about before with a pheochromocytoma that jacks up your blood pressure really high, makes you feel pretty terrible. So those things need to be ruled out in patients with NF. Early puberty, had a patient that with NF growing much faster than other patients. And then when you look, you actually see there's some puberty development in that little child. That needs to be seen by an endocrinologist and a neuro-oncologist, and imaging needs to be done to look for a tumor in the brain that actually sends out the wrong signals and makes a patient go into puberty early. They can have other endocrine issues as well with growth hormone deficiency. And what's the right time to potentially replace that? That's a big issue. And then issues with tumors, that Diane-Symphalis syndrome is a tumor-related issue that can cause patients to be really thin, or gynecomastia, which is abnormal breast tissue development. All right, and lastly, the neurocognitive needs. So we have neuropsychologists. Why do we need them involved in our care? We do know that there are cognitive risks. They can have some patients, not every patient is different, but they can have issues with visual spatial or visual motor abilities, attention, executive functioning, really making the right choice between, I can do this or I can do this, what are the consequences there? That sometimes that's really hard for some patients. Verbal skills can be a problem, fine motor coordination. When they get school aged, those numbers are all over the place. Between 30 and 65% can be diagnosed with a learning disability. For patients with Schwannomatosis, hearing abnormalities can affect school performance. Then what do these types of issues, how does that correlate with developing friendships and relating to peers of their own age? So ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and what can we do to help? So we have a neuropsychologist on our team. I recommend every patient get baseline neurocognitive testing. We usually try to do that by the time they're in kindergarten or first grade. We can do it sooner if we need to. But that really, what it does is says, okay, this is where this person's at this point in time. What are they strong at? And what are some areas that are weak? How do we use these parts that they're stronger with, the way they process, to help with these weak? And then we can choose to share as much of that with the school as we want, to advocate for resources in the school. And that's where the neuropsychologist works with our school liaison, and really advocates to make sure the schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing. A lot of our school systems are fantastic, but I'll tell you, we've run into a few that we've really had to fight back with. And then sometimes it's just because of lack of knowledge. They don't know what that means. They have no idea what NF is. And so we need to educate them. And our school liaison is a great person to go in and say, this is what this child has, and these are the ways that we need to be able to help. So they're held accountable, and the family doesn't have to feel like they put all that weight on their own shoulders. Our social needs, the social worker can help. I mean, what you heard me say over and over again is, we may need to get you in with this specialist. We may need you to come back for imaging. We may need this, we may need that. And a lot of our patients in Alabama live, in Dothan, in the South, like far away. And that's hard. That's really hard to coordinate all of that care. I'm very lucky in our clinic. Micah spends a lot of time working to try to make sure people can get up here and be seen for an MRI, be seen for their eye exam. How do we do that efficiently? And do they need help getting here? Right? Like, can we help provide a gas card? If that's the barrier to care, we want to do that. We want these kids to be seen. So what do you need as a family, and how can we try to address that? And then again, with our child life specialists, I'm so grateful to them because they can really help kids process everything they're going through. And when we start treatment, they can help process what that looks like for them and their journey. And a lot of times it becomes, a place where the kids come and they don't mind coming to see us. And that, I love it when we get there. That's a fun place to be, where they come to clinic and we're a part of their team and a part of their family. All right, very last thing. I just wanted to touch on this because I think some people, when we say multidisciplinary clinic, sometimes you expect everybody to be in one place in one space. And that's a dream. There's part of that Dr. Brown and I are trying to work on how to make some of that possible. But it is really hard to pull in a surgeon and an audiologist and an ophthalmologist all in the exact same clinic space. So that's one model of the combined clinic model, having everybody there. The other is this consult model, which is really what most teams around the country end up doing, or some combination of these two, where we have a very specific geneticist, neurologist. We have, we've identified our ENT doc. When we know these people and they know us, they know NF, and that becomes a team, and it's a multidisciplinary team that knows each patient. Even though we're not always able to be all in the same room talking at the same time. Again, sometimes I really like this when we can combine that, and we are able to bring in the rehab medicine doc to our clinic to help talk about the AFO problem at the same time that we're talking about the brain tumor. We want to serve our patients the best way we possibly can, and that model continues to evolve. And I'm excited to see how it continues to evolve, because as she said, I got here in 2018 and came here. Part of the reason was because of what Dr. Korf had built here with NF, and I was really excited to join on this team. And so got to work with him on what his vision was for clinic. And now Dr. Brown's coming in and we're working together to keep building upon that. So I can't express enough how much we are working for you guys, and we know we can get better. We want your feedback for that as well. But this is a journey with all of us. We're here to help. And I'll leave you with this, that nothing in life is to be feared. It's to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so we can fear less. And, it's not lost on me that we sit up here and talk about, these are all the things that might happen. All of these things don't happen usually to one person, but they can happen. And that's really scary. And I think, as a parent, to sit on the other side of that conversation and say, wait, what are you thinking about? What's possible? And we know our parents would trade spaces with their kids in a heartbeat if they could. But what I try to emphasize is we can't control all of this, right? We're working to control as many things as we can, but let's understand what we can understand, make the best decision we can with information that we have, and keep moving forward with that particular person, that patient, your child in mind, on what we can do. So thank you guys all for being here. We appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.
So this is actually one of the aspects of this event that I was most excited about, because I've been to many NF and Schwannomatosis events where we hear from oncologists and neurologists and psychologists, et cetera, about all of the interventions that we can offer patients, but we don't often hear from the surgeons. And I'd like for this to be an annual component of our symposium, because a lot of the answers to the questions that are asked here are surgical. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce Dr. Walsh. Dr. Erica Walsh is a neuro-otologist specializing in lateral skull-based surgery, implantable hearing devices, and chronic ear diseases. She treats the full spectrum of neuro-otology patients, including children and adults with hearing loss, chronic ear infections, I can never pronounce this, cholesteatoma, vestibular disorders, and benign and malignant tumors of the skull base, with special expertise in and experience with patients with phacomatoses, which is the category of diseases for NF1 and NF2, including NF1, NF2, and meningiomatosis and Schwannomatosis. A graduate of Harvard, Dr. Walsh first came to UAB in 2012 as a resident in the Department of Otolaryngology. After completing her neuro-otology fellowship at the Michigan Ear Institute, she was thrilled to return as faculty in 2019. She's proud to care for a diverse population of patients who hail from the entire Southeast region and nationally. And I personally would like to say that Dr. Walsh sought me out when I joined UAB. She said, I need to meet with you and I need to be a part of this program. So she's very special because she really, really cares about this patient population. Dr. Jones, Jesse Jones, is a board-certified radiologist with neurointerventional subspecialty training. He performs percutaneous tumor ablation as well as pre-surgical embolization. Dr. Jones's research interests include the genetic and molecular basis of disease, as well as biomedical device development. And then we have Dr. Jayarajan, who I think I may have left his information. Let me go grab it 1 second. Apologies to Dr. Jayarajan, my papers were not in order. Dr. Harry Shankar Jayarajan is an ear, nose, and throat doctor and a plastic surgeon at UAB. He received his medical degree from Monash University Faculty of Medicine and has been in practice for more than 20 years, which is hard to imagine because he looks very, very young. He specializes in surgeries of the head and neck, as well as performing facial reconstruction and facial reanimation after facial nerve paralysis. So that's a topic that would be of great interest to our patients here. He treats both pediatric and adult NF1 and Schwannomatosis, including NF2 patients. So please join me in welcoming our 3 speakers. So we're fortunate enough to have some volunteers from the genetics counseling students, and they are going to ask a series of questions that are based on actual questions that have come to me through clinic. So I'm going to invite them up to the podium.
Okay, hi. The first question is, in layman's terms, can each of you tell the audience what your expertise is with regards to NF in Schwannomatosis? Walsh, then Jayarajan, then Jones.
I'll start. First of all, thanks for having me today. It's a real privilege to be here and to talk to all of you. So I'm a neurotologist, which is a subspecialty of ENT, and we all have kind of funny, fancy names. Neurotology is a really small subspecialty, so there are less than 350 of us in the United States who are board certified as neurotologists. But we live at an interesting intersection between ear, nose, and throat and neurosurgery. And so I can provide surgical expertise in the ear and the inner ear and that area of what we call the skull base. So when I tell people I do skull base surgery, I say, think of the brain case as a cube, okay? And we're talking about the bottom part of the cube, and that's an area that requires some specialized technique and skill to access, and that's what I can provide for my patients. And so in the context of NF, really you're going to be working with me most of the time if you or your loved one has a vestibular schwannoma. That's right in my wheelhouse. There are lots of other areas, obviously, that intersect with that part of the anatomy.
Dr. Jones? Dr. Jones, oh, there you go.
Does Harry want to go ahead, or I can go? Whatever.
You can go. The question was, can you explain in layman's terms how you can contribute to patients who have NF or Schwannomatosis?
Yeah, so I apologize I can't be there to see y'all in person. I'm at another meeting in Dallas, but I'm a radiologist primarily by training, so diagnosing these lesions in this disease is one thing that I focus on primarily through reading the MRI scans, of the brain, of the orbits, and the head and neck. And beyond this, the diagnostic services that we provide, I'll also do treatment sometimes in association with Dr. Walsh or Harry in terms of getting patients ready for a surgery by reducing the blood supply to the tumors and making the surgery less bloody and easier and faster. In certain cases where tumors are inaccessible or difficult to reach, what I'll do is go in and place a probe that can either burn or freeze locally some of these tumors and treat them in that manner.
Awesome. And then Dr. Jayarajan.
Yeah, hi guys. Again, I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm actually running a dissection lab at the moment. I'm primarily a head and neck oncologist. I also have skull-based training and particularly training in facial reanimation. So I tend to be involved a lot more with the very large plexiform neurofibromas as part of a multidisciplinary approach in debulking the tumors so that we can then treat them with with systemic medications. I also work in helping people who have facial palsy or facial drooping, either from facial paralysis or just from the weight of the tumor, in making their face look as close to normal as I can again.
Excellent. Let's go on to the next question.
Okay, our next question. My doctor told me that there is a tumor in my hearing nerve that will make me deaf in that ear, but she's also saying I shouldn't have it removed right now. Dr. Walsh, why wouldn't you just remove all vestibular schwannomas as soon as they are detected?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a surgeon. I love to do surgery. My fervent hope for patients who have vestibular schwannomas is that, especially of the NF2 variety, is that someday that's a non-surgical disease, that it's a disease that we're able to treat with a targeted medication. And you say, well, why? Why is that? And I do a lot of vestibular schwannoma surgery. To go in and remove the tumor from the hearing and balance nerve. And in fact, in this area where these tumors come from, they're one nerve still. So the hearing and balance nerve travel together and then they kind of split off at the inner ear. We talked a little bit about this earlier today. Schwannomas of that hearing nerve are difficult to separate that nerve without compromising function. That hearing nerve is very intolerant of dissection. And so when we choose to operate on a vestibular schwannoma and there's still hearing left, we are rolling the dice a little bit about whether or not we can save hearing. And it can be difficult to predict preoperatively based on imaging or other characteristics how amenable a tumor is going to be separated from that nerve without damaging it. This is more of a concern in NF2 and these genetic schwannomas because they tend to be very tightly adherent to the nerve. So we do hearing preservation surgery or surgery where we try to save the hearing nerve quite commonly on patients who have what we call sporadic or just kind of out of nowhere vestibular schwannomas. But the behavior of the NF2 schwannomas is a little different. They tend to be more aggressive, more tightly adherent to the nerve. And sometimes we actually go in there and find there are multiple tumors. Really importantly, to that point, the second nerve that runs along that hearing and balance nerve is the facial nerve, the nerve that lets you blink and smile. And on imaging, even with sophisticated MRI, it can be almost impossible to determine whether it comes from the facial nerve or comes from the hearing and balance nerve. So we go in and we do a craniotomy, we open up the skull, we get to the nerve. There's a possibility it could be from the facial nerve or so tightly adherent to that facial nerve where we take its function. And then our chances of hearing preservation, even in small tumors, is usually less than 50%. And so it's shared decision-making. That's not to say it's never appropriate in a hearing patient to go and remove their vestibular schwannoma. That's definitely not what I want to say. But it has to be a discussion about why are we taking out the tumor now versus trying to buy as much time as we can with hearing. And that's when we get to things like chemotherapies and other systemic therapies that we have optimism will help patients with these tumors. So there's the risk to the facial nerve, and then there's the risk of losing what hearing you have left. And those are the two main reasons in patients we sometimes choose to observe or keep an eye on these tumors.
Erica, is there any role for radiosurgery in those kinds of tumors or no?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes there are a few pieces to that discussion. One concern that this particular flavor of schwannoma is somewhat less radiosensitive than the sporadic form of it. And then also a concern about the potential of what we call malignant transformation. So when you zap a tumor with radiation, you're causing change in the DNA, and that's what stops it from growing. And there's concern that if you zap a tumor that already has a genetic mutation that we know about and you're adding actual additional DNA damage, there's the potential that could actually behave more aggressively. And so it's not a never thing, but it's not our first line for growing tumors in most patients.
Great answer and great question. Let's move on to the next one.
All right, this third question is, my son is 8. He has a tumor on one side of his face that is getting bigger and his ear is drooping. The other kids at school are starting to call him names. My NF doctor said that it is not the right time to start the tumor medication treatment. Dr. Jayarajan, when is the right time to operate on a child for cosmetic reasons? And can you remove all of the plexiform tumor of the face? And if not, why is that?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question with not a very easy answer. So the problem with with a lot of these surgeries, these plexiform tumors, is they don't really obey a lot of the rules of a lot of our standard tumors. They can be quite pervasive and difficult to clear completely without significant risk to vital structures such as the facial nerve and the big blood vessels. It'd be really nice to be able to remove the entire tumor so no one has to worry about it again. But most of the time when we operate on these big, what we call plexiform tumors, it's really about debulking it so that we can control the disease, and especially in combination with the newer age drugs. With regards to children, so most of my surgery, most of my referral base is probably skewed because I see mostly teenagers and adults. Renee Myers, I think there's a lot more of the younger children. I think that most of us would say we try and avoid particularly large surgeries in children under the age of 10, but it also depends on exactly what the surgery is. If with plexiform neurofibromas, the goal is really trying to keep control of the disease and try as best to make the patient's life as normal as possible. If the problem is a droopy ear, that's a little easier for us to fix because the surgery that's required is a little bit smaller, and we can avoid a lot of the key structures such as the facial nerve and debulking the tumor and resuspending the ear. The other problem is with these tumors, as you grow, the tumor grows, and so a lot of the time we'll do a surgery to debulk tumor. Sometimes, particularly when they're young and the tumor is smaller, we can get most of the tumor out. That doesn't mean it's going to be that way for life. And what can often happen is we'll have a patient where I'll do a temporal resection on, it will look great. And then 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, the tumor will regrow and require repeat surgery. And so that all has to be taken into account when we sort of discuss a treatment plan for each individual patient. And so as with a lot of these tumors, it's very much a multidisciplinary discussion. We all sort of get on board and try and figure out what the best options are for the patient at this time and then moving forward down the track.
So similar to what Dr. Walsh said, these are very complicated questions and it requires a multidisciplinary team and a lot of discussion with what are the goals and when is the right time to proceed. Let's move on to the next question.
So our fourth question is, 20 years ago, my doctor told me that this nerve tumor on my leg can't be removed because the bleeding risk is too high. I've been living with it for so long, but I wish I could just have it removed. Dr. Jones, is there anything in particular that you can do to help make surgeries safer when a tumor has large blood vessels in it?
Yeah, so these tumors have a variety of vascularity to them. Some are fairly dry, meaning they don't have a ton, and others can be quite bloody or vascular. And usually, when these are being worked up with an MRI, we'll be able to get a sense of that, looking at the images of the MRI and seeing lots of blood vessels. That's going to give a surgeon pause and say, hey, look, when I get into this it may actually be quite bloody. And that may be from this vignette you described what was going on there. When that's the case, all hope's not lost. There are strategies now to reduce the vasculature before the surgeon goes in and does a resection. And typically that would involve a procedure called an angiogram, where someone like myself would go in and access the artery, typically in a patient's leg or in their wrist. And once you're inside of one of these arteries, the body's connected up like a highway, and you can go kind of from one artery to the next fairly seamlessly. And so we'd navigate some devices into this area of this tumor. For this case, it sounds like it's in the lower extremity of the leg. And we do some pictures there, injecting dye into these arteries and watching where this dye goes, seeing if a bunch is going into this tumor and so forth, collecting in there, or the tumor is almost invisible on these studies, suggesting it's actually not very vascular. If there is quite a bit of dye going to these tumors, suggesting that there is a lot of vascularity there, then there would be an opportunity to go in to these vessels that are supplying the tumor specifically and not the rest of the leg and not the muscle, not the nerve, but the actual tumor tissue. And if we can get our devices into these specific vessels, we can basically close them up with impunity using either a glue-like material or some kind of mechanical thing like a little coil or plug. And we'll work away at this through whatever arteries we can access and reduce and reduce and reduce until this tumor is almost, in my mind, devascularized. The surgeon will tell you a bit differently. There's always going to be some supply, no matter what, to these tumors, but getting it to the point where hopefully the surgery is much more tenable.
Really exciting. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question.
All right, so our fifth question is, I'm in college and working a part-time job. I have a vestibular schwannoma on both sides, but I hear well enough to get by. I'm so busy, I think I'll take a break from MRI scans and hearing tests for the next few years until I get through school. Dr. Walsh, why are hearing tests and imaging scans important in schwannomatosis, and what are the risks of missing one or multiple appointments?
This is a great question, and I can't emphasize enough how much empathy I have for my patients who have complex medical issues that require a lot of time and resources. I see, 35, 40 patients in a clinic and that's my life. But for every single one of those people, that's time away from their work, from their education. That's the cost financially to make it here. That's the cost in terms of their time. I was joking to Dr. Matrock earlier. I kind of hate going to the doctor. Maybe I'm a traitor to my profession.
I hate it too.
I never said that. Don't tell anyone I said that. But so I just want you guys to know, I get it. I get it. I get why it's hard. I especially get why it would be hard for a young adult or a teen who wants to be out there living their life. But this is really important. And we get back to the old question, the question you asked me first about, okay, well, if I have a schwannoma and I may lose my hearing anyway, what does it matter? Well, it's a few things. One, we want to understand how your tumors are growing or changing over time. So what's really important about schwannomas is that their growth is nonlinear. And that just sounds like jargon. What does that mean? It means that they may grow for a period of time and then not grow, or they may have periods of growth and periods of relative stability. And understanding where you are on that trajectory is going to help us know what we have out there to offer you, whether that's a chemotherapeutic option, whether your tumor has enlarged to a size where we actually do need to think about surgery because it's putting compression on other areas of the brain that may be problematic, whether or not you might be suitable for a trial. So if you have a certain amount of growth that may put you in a certain level of hearing, that may put you in the realm for something else that we can offer. So, for me, I watch patients with hearing tests and I work closely with my audiology colleagues, and I'll acknowledge that when I see my patients have hearing decline, regardless of what we can offer them in terms of other therapies, it's always discouraging for the patient and for me. I hate to see it. But if I know what your hearing level is, I know what we can offer you in terms of technology. Okay, so this young lady in this vignette has really no hearing in one ear and hearing in the other ear. We have some technologies that we may be able to offer her that can help her do better in the classroom setting or in the social setting. And so the data isn't just so we can look at it and say, yep, the tumors are still there. It actually helps us decide how we can help you today and how we might help you in the future. Both of those pieces of information.
It's a really important point. It's not just about the tumor. I think that's what's really special about our program. It's what else do we have to offer to make your life easier? And how much time can we give you, ideally, until a better or newer treatment comes out that can also help? Let's move on to the next question.
Our sixth question is, I had a vestibular schwannoma removed 15 years ago, and after the surgery, I woke up with a facial droop. I still drool from that side of my face, and that eye is always dry and red. Dr. Jayarajan, can you do anything now to help with the patient's drooling and eye irritation? Would there have been more options if the patient had been able to see you right after the surgery?
Yeah, so there's a lot of options available for facial reanimation or correcting facial droop and tearing and drooling. And the type of options available do change depending on how long after the nerve injury the patient is seen. There's certainly a lot of options after 15 years. There are definitely a lot of options available. When you're seen closer to the time of injury, depending on how much of the normal nerve is able to be preserved, we can do options that basically either connect the nerve back together or use other nerves around that area to try and recreate a patient's smile and give their tone back. Over time, like after 15 years, when the muscles no longer have innervation, those muscles tend to weaken or atrophy. And in that situation, in order to get your face functioning in a way as close to its normal function as possible, we often have to do procedures where we take muscle from elsewhere in the body and transfer them to that area. So we sort of almost like donating a muscle group from somewhere else and use that to sort of re-innovate the face again, because the muscles that are there have been denervated for so long that even if we put nerves up to them, they're not going to really work. And so that's kind of, and there's a lot of different options when it comes to muscle transfers. But all that to say, there are definitely options available, even 15 years down the track. Yes, when you're seen sooner, we sometimes have more options available, but that doesn't mean that there's no options available now. And this is something that we manage as part of a multidisciplinary team. UAB, we have ophthalmological surgeons, we have facial nerve therapists, and other facial nerve surgeons like myself that see patients in a group setting and really try and figure out what are the main goals for the patient and try and find options that suit them.
That gives a lot of hope, I think, to a lot of patients who are facing these same issues. And from what I understand from what you said, it sounds like if the nerve is damaged and it's no longer reaching out to the muscle, that muscle kind of becomes like beef jerky. It's sitting there. You're not going to get it to do its thing anymore. So you need to bring in a muscle from somewhere else that has a nerve attached to it that you can use to replace the muscle that's no longer functioning. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So after about 12 to 18 months, if there's been no nerve feeding that muscle, those muscle fibers stop working. You can say they're like jerky. And so certainly after 15 years, you're better off getting a new muscle group with a nerve attached to it.
Really exciting work. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question.
Yeah, so question 7, I have a nerve tumor right next to my spine that hurts all the time, especially while I am walking, and now that leg is getting weaker. The neurosurgeon says that surgery could make my pain worse or give me a permanent limp. Dr. Jones, do you use any non-surgical minimally invasive techniques that might help? And then also in general, how might these outcomes compare to surgery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is another space where there's not just one right answer. You know, I think this is really the importance of being at a multidisciplinary center. We're able to see expert perspectives from different specialties. So these patients would typically come and see me, but they'd also see a neurosurgeon, as the vignette implies, and potentially also a radiosurgeon. Those are the three modalities that are typically used in this situation. If the schwannoma or neurofibroma is amenable to surgical resection without causing a deficit or potentially long-term pain, that's probably their best option because it's going to give them the best chance of a cure. In some cases, that's just not possible. If this tumor is wrapped up in the nerve in the sense that it may not be separable, or the access is not feasible to get to it, you know, from the skin incision to get to this nerve safely, then we start thinking about other options, and those would involve zapping it, like Dr. Walsh had mentioned, for some of these schwannomas in the inner ear. We can also zap things other parts of the body, but there are risks with that in terms of causing perhaps more aggressive behavior of these already, you know, genetically affected tumors. What I could potentially offer is a procedure where we'd insert a small, like, needle tip into the tumor through the skin, using imaging to guide us. Typically, we use a CAT scan, where we would take a scan of this portion of the body and map a course from this tumor to the skin, typically across a straight line, which does not traverse any critical structures. It may traverse some muscle or some fat planes. But if we can get a needle tip into that location, right into kind of the so-called the center or bulk of the tumor, that tissue is all pathologic tissue. And so at this point, we can either heat or cool, depending on what our goals are. Most typically, we start with cooling or freezing these tumors. And that tip will create an ice ball and will basically kill or destroy this tumoral tissue through a thermal effect. And that can be monitored also during the CT scan, because ice is very apparent on the CT. And so we'll typically freeze for a couple minutes. We'll take a scan, look at the margins. If the ice ball is not big enough, we'll continue to freeze. If we're happy with where it's at, we'll stop the procedure and remove the needle. And this can destroy that tumoral tissue and hopefully give the patient some relief.
Sounds like sci-fi.
Kind of
That's
is.
cool. Let's move on to the next question, please.
All right. I have vestibular schwannomas in both ears. I can't hear at all out of my left ear. I can hear out of my right ear pretty well, not perfectly, but my hearing has been stable in that ear for 5 years. Dr. Walsh, which hearing aids would you recommend for this patient? And can you describe the basic types of hearing aids and what types of sounds they help you to detect?
Sure. So this is a great example of where working with my audiology colleagues is so important, because they're really good at all the tech of hearing aids, in terms of some of them have cool Bluetooth capabilities and that sort of things that make sense for patients in different scenarios. But functionally, a hearing aid is a very sophisticated amplifier that does digital processing of sound. So what does that mean? It takes in a sound and it can separate the sound by frequency, intensity, and then the hearing aid is programmed to an individual's hearing loss. So if you have more trouble hearing in the high frequencies, the hearing aid is going to selectively amplify those, and try to help things become more clear for you. So in this vignette, you have someone who has some degree of hearing loss in one ear, and we'll call it a non-functional ear on the other side. And so there are a few options that a person like this could pursue. They could just wear a hearing aid in their good ear. So they may say, honestly, like that would be great. And some people like that, and that's enough of an option for them. That does create a problem when someone's on their quote unquote bad side, right? On the bad side ear. So you can imagine if your right ear is your bad ear and you're driving a car and your passenger's trying to talk to you, you're going to miss a lot of what they say. And so we have a couple of technologies that help us leverage the good ear. A simple non-surgical one is a cross hearing aid system, and that's an acronym, CROS. And so that's where you wear a device in both ears, but the device on the poor side is a receiver. So it picks up sound and then it wirelessly sends it to your good ear. So it keeps you from missing things on that side of your head. That's a great option because it's non-surgical, and it can be adjusted as a person's hearing changes. However, hearing out of both ears is important for localizing sound. So being able to know where sound comes from. Many people who have hearing in just one ear function fine in the day-to-day world. But if you've heard well in both ears and then you lose that piece is frustrating to people. And so these technologies that leverage the good ear don't help with that piece. Something that was alluded to earlier is a bone conduction hearing aid. One is called a bone anchored hearing aid or a Baha. There's another brand that produces something called a Ponto. But they actually take advantage of the same technology that was developed for dental implants. So if you're familiar with that, it's like a post that goes into the bone of your jaw, except for the bone conduction, we put it in your skull. So I put a little post in the skull that integrates into the bone and then has a processor that can clip to it. The human skull is an amazing sound conductor. So you put this bone conduction device on the poor hearing side, it picks up sound, creates vibration that then immediately goes to the good ear. And so that can be a nice option for folks who don't want to wear things in their ears or have good enough hearing on their good side that they wouldn't need to wear a device in that side anyway. It is an MRI compatible device, which is really super important when we think about, what happens to a patient after we place it. The surgery is the easy part. It's everything that comes after. But this too does not create sound localization. I'm going to briefly talk about two technologies that are kind of out there. One is cochlear implants. Cochlear implants are placed inside the inner ear and stimulate the nerve of hearing. They often are not a very useful tool in patients who have neurofibromatosis or vestibular schwannomas because the problem there is the nerve of hearing. That's where the tumor is. So us stimulating it with a cochlear implant is less likely to be successful. There are nuances to that discussion. There are some unusual scenarios where we may try that in a patient as kind of that's their last effort, but realistically, that usually does not produce the kind of outcomes we get in the general population who receives a cochlear implant because of the nature of the disease. The last option is for patients who have no hearing, which is not the young lady in this vignette, something called an auditory brainstem implant. That's a device that's placed on the cochlear nucleus, which is a part of the brain that takes the signal from the inner ear and sends it to the brain. While that is really the only option we have for patients who don't have a cochlear nerve on both sides or have tumor burden on both hearing nerves that makes it so that they can't hear, the real truth about ABI is that most patients are not going to be able to communicate independently with that. So what I mean by that is that they're not going to be able to understand speech clearly enough to rely on that for communication. So that device may provide sound awareness in the context of other forms of communication, whether that's lip reading, talk-to-text technology, or that sort of thing. But a young lady like this, we've got some tools in our toolbox. We would sit down and talk with her and say, you know, what's your life and lifestyle? My audiologist would sit down with her and kind of go through the options, and we have some tools for that.
Wow, we're lucky to have you. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question.
Our next question is, the bones in my face didn't form properly because of my NF, and one side looks different from the other. I've never been comfortable with the way I look, but I didn't think anything could be done. Dr. Jayarajan, what new technologies are you using to bring symmetry back to patients' faces who had bone irregularities since birth?
Sure, it's a good question. It's again, it's not always a straightforward answer. It depends a lot on exactly what the bony irregularity is, and more importantly, what exactly the cosmetic concerns are. But there are a lot of different options available for patients. See, it's hard to make things perfect, but sometimes it's due to bony overgrowth, particularly around the mandible, sometimes over the zygoma, which is the cheekbone. And we can use different options. We can use saws. We can also use ultrasonic devices to sort of shave the bone down, to trim it down, to reduce the bulk. When we do that, it's always keeping in mind the nerves and other vital structures around that area, because we don't want to injure those in trying to achieve some kind of symmetry. Sometimes the bone is lost, or the bone is very, very small, in which case sometimes we have to replace the bone either with a free bone graft, sometimes from the rib, or a vascularized bone graft, which basically means a bone that comes with its own blood supply. And that can sometimes be necessary for the lower jaw bones that can be very underdeveloped. Sometimes it's also important to re-support the eye. Sometimes the floor of the eye, the bone that supports the eye, is gone, and we have to find a way of re-supporting that. Sometimes we use free bone grafts. Other times we can just use plates that have properties that allow them to integrate into the body. So we can use plates to help reconstruct areas where the bone has been lost. Sometimes all we have to do is to try and recreate a bit of fullness for contour. And in those situations, we don't even have to dress the bone. Sometimes we can take fat and use free fat grafting or use fillers to help to recreate the appearance of symmetry, even if the bone underlying that has not been changed. So again, it's kind of, I was going to say horses for courses, but I think that is an Australian aphorism. I don't think anyone here understands what that means. So it really depends on the patient and the actual concerns that they have. There's lots of different options available. Some are more invasive than others, such as taking bone grafts that had their own blood supply. They are a bit more invasive than just using fillers. But it depends on the patient and the clinical situation. And again, it's done with in a multidisciplinary setting where we have a discussion and find out exactly what we can offer that gives the patient exactly what they want for the least risk and least risk of complications.
Dr. Jayarajan, as a follow-up question, would that be considered cosmetic surgery or would that be covered under insurance?
Oof, I think that is a very complicated discussion. I think it really depends on if it's just for facial contouring, then it becomes a cosmetic procedure. If it's functionally debilitating, so let's say that the eye needs better support to improve their ability to see clearly, then that can be done functionally. If it's affecting their ability to open their mouth and chew, then it's a functional problem. But otherwise, if it's a contouring, it becomes merely a cosmetic issue.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question.
All right. I have painful nerve tumors all up and down my arms. I don't want any more surgeries because I'm scarred up everywhere as it is. Dr. Jones, if you saw this patient, would you use a different technique for schwannomas versus neurofibromas? And how many can you treat in one sitting? And does it matter which nerve the tumor is on?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So these people obviously we'll see with lots of tumors, the question becomes which one is causing pain. And it's not always straightforward. You know, is it the largest one? Is it the most metabolically active one, which means they'll get a scan, which looks not just at the size of the tumor, but actually how much energy that tumor is using. And that's something that we can use sometimes to distinguish tumors which may be becoming more aggressive in terms of becoming cancerous, but it's also may tell us something about their activity in terms of if it becomes symptomatic from a pain perspective. Or also if they've grown rapidly, you know, if they had a scan a year ago and one tumor amongst many has changed and the patient's symptoms have also changed, that may be the culprit as well. And sometimes it comes down to just the pragmatics of reaching these lesions. Like I alluded to earlier, there needs to be a fairly straight path from the skin to the tumor. And if these tumors are hiding behind a major blood vessel or a major normal nerve that we're trying to preserve, that makes this less of a viable option. So I'll typically look all these things in consideration, but we can certainly do more than one tumor at once. And so that may be 3 or 4, just to kind of depending on the patient-specific tumor burden and also which ones are accessible and which ones maybe have some of these characteristics like the metabolic activity, recent growth.
Awesome. Thank you. How many questions do we have left?
That was it.
That was the last one. Well, we're going to have questions to the panel in just a minute. Actually, we can just open it up for that right now. So are you willing to take questions from the audience to our panel speakers? Yes?
Be happy to, yeah.
Okay.
So, Dr. Walsh, I'm going to direct this to you, but anybody that has anything that can offer help is greatly appreciated. So, my son is 29. He underwent tumor resections to his vestibular schwannomas in 2015 and 2016. Prior to his tumor resections, he was on bevacizumab for 34 treatments. On his 35th treatment, he had a reaction. The medicine was stopped. 6 months later, his hearing and his balance tanked, and we had to make the decision for surgery. So now all these years later, he's an adult, still has NF, and we still need to monitor him. What are his options as an adult going forward? First of all, everything everyone has said is wonderful, and we are here because we need a multidisciplinary care team for sure. So I don't know, just anything you might have to offer us going forward. We're trying to make a decision to move to Alabama for your team. So,
well, there are a few points here. You can, I guess, part of the question is whether or not there's any tumor left. So sometimes there's not a complete resection of the tumor that has to be followed, and that's a little bit of a different discussion. Does he have any hearing? None, yeah. So the only option in that scenario in a person who's already had resection or surgery on their vestibular schwannomas and does not have hearing afterwards, usually the only viable option in that scenario would be something like an auditory brainstem implant. There are almost certainly some neuroplasticity type changes, meaning the brain kind of molds and shapes itself over time, depending on what parts of the brain that are stimulated, that happen after a person has complete hearing loss. So the farther you are out from a hearing loss, and then you go to try to stimulate those parts of the brain that are responsible for hearing, the less certain the outcome is going to be. But ABI, auditory brainstem implant, again, really can provide sound awareness, but in my experience is not in the vast majority of patients going to give really language communication. So you're not going to be able to really hear speech with that. And so many of my patients I talk to are less excited about the idea of doing a craniotomy because it does require another brain surgery to place an ABI. Less excited about that piece of it if it doesn't mean that they'll be able to independently listen with that device, that they'll be able to hear like they once did. And so once the schwannomas have been operated on, really it's about looking and seeing if there's any additional growth or progression of any tumor cells that might be left. I do recommend, of course, all these patients continue to be surveilled or watched because they can develop tumors on other portions of what's left, including the facial nerve, that nerve that lets you blink and smile. But this is a scenario where I don't know that we have a great surgical option for hearing when you have this degree of hearing loss that would result in just speech communication.
Okay, I just want to say that I experienced firsthand. Dr. Harry was my surgeon earlier in the year, and he could have been very aggressive and pushed to try to get more debulking of the tumor, but he did not. He was very thoughtful and cautious and cared more about me than trying to push where he shouldn't have. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Harry, for doing that and taking care of me.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, this closes our session, I believe. I would like to do a huge thank you, and I'm going to walk over here so I can wave to them. Lene and Rose, get you in here. Can you grab Rose too? Oh, Rose just left. This is Lene and Rose, who you saw at the front desk, have really made this happen. These two have done the artwork and the schedules. They've collaborated with donors. They have put together mailings. They set up everything that was here. And literally, when I say this couldn't have been done without them, this could have been done without me. This could not have been done without them. So please give them a big round of applause.